now. Okay. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to our series from United States, from European countries, from Australia, and from China. It's our great honor and a pleasure to have you all in this conference. First of all, we would like to express our thanks to scholars who are not today with us, but have given us very precious support of this conference. Professor Steve Smith, Nicholas Onoff, Patrick Jackson, and Ruth Smith has offered us very precious suggestions about this conference. Thank you very much. Secondly, we would like to express our thanks to our Western and Chinese series in this conference room. We have tried our best to find the best time for every of us, but unfortunately, the time difference is really a headache for us. So some of us have to get up very early, whereas others have to go to bed rather late. We do apologize for that. Probably we can solve this problem next sometime if we could have a conference in Beijing or in some other place instead of online conference. Thank you very much for your cooperation and tolerance. I think we should pay our great respect to the Chinese school scholars who in the last 20 years, despite the numerous suspicion and critique from within and from abroad, has tried to spend their 20 years, the most important academic life, to the cause of theory innovation. Without their constant hard work, we cannot sit here and talk about the academic quality of the Chinese school, because it would be something not exist at all. And we would also express our thanks to Western theorists for your very precious suggestions and comments on the China in recent 5 years. And before that, it's only a topic that we just suspect its existence. So Chinese school is only in its early stage of development. It has some breakthrough. However, it has many issues to be identified and to be addressed.
鲁鹏，我们看不到你呀，你那儿好像停了。
Cannot do this kind of self-reflective things, but very insightful suggestions and comments. As we have reiterated in our previous, 看不到吗 ？Really?
现在可以听到了。
Come back. So, okay, I will make a very brief opening. Welcome now. So we view this conference as a starting point of a large project of the dialogue between Western and Chinese theorists. That means we only expect this conference as a platform for Chinese and Western theorists to exchange ideas, to know each other's position to the similar topic as a Chinese school. It also means that we do not expect anything more than that in this conference. But in the dialogue, we see that in the last 3 years, there are 3 or 4 branches of the Chinese school emerged in Chinese higher discourse, and there are some kind of this or that kind of dialogue between Chinese and Western theorists regarding specific branch of the Chinese school. This kind of interaction is helpful, but it might lead to some kind of misunderstanding. Western higher theorists might think this or that kind of branch of Chinese school is a whole story of Chinese school, and this is certainly not true. And the Chinese theorists might believe that this or that kind of Western feedback, negative or positive as it might be, represented the whole opinion of Western theorists. So both are not necessarily correct. So misunderstanding occurs in both sides. That's why both Professor Zhang and I, we initiated this comprehensive dialogue. We invited Chinese theorists, so the internet doesn't work again. And we invited Western theorists from not only the mainstream American theorists, but also from the English school, and we invited Marxist scholars, as well as we pay attention to the gender issue. So we invited many female theorists. We hope this kind of a comprehensive dialogue between various branches of Chinese school scholars and between various theoretical perspectives from Western theorists can eliminate such kind of misunderstanding between each other. So in the next 3.5 hours, I will try to be silent and even invisible because I don't have theory myself. I only provided this platform for Chinese and Western theorists to exchange ideas. So I would only act when a theorist considerably exceeded the 15 minutes limit of the time. So each of us have 15 minutes. Chinese and Western theorists will equally have 15 minutes of time to talk about their topic. We hope this will show the equal position of each other, equal treated of each other. And we hope this dialogue will increase the diversity of our theoretical studies instead of consolidate the possible isolated division of this discipline together. And then we'll begin our Krasner.
I'm here.
Steve. So you have, I'm sorry for that. The time is really unfriendly to you. Sorry for that. So thank you, Steve. So in the next hour, we have invited 4 Chinese theorists to talk about the Chinese school. And 3 of the scholars comes from 3 branches of the Chinese school, respectively as a moral realism, relational theory, and a symbiosis theory. And Professor Zhang Feng has played a very important role in the formation of the moral realism, but he himself seems not to belong to the moral realism at current stage. So these 4 scholars will certainly offer us very different and interesting stories about the Chinese school. So Professor Yan, please.
Okay, thank you, Lu Peng. Can every friend hear me clearly?
Yes.
Okay, good. Thank you very much, Barry. Okay, I will be very brief. I try to keep my presentation within 10 minutes to leave time for discussion. Actually, you know, I think most of you already know that I'm minority in China about the term of a Chinese school. And the term Chinese school actually welcomed by the Chinese government, advocated by many Chinese scholars. But I hold a different view from them. And the reason I do not support the idea of a Chinese school because 3 reasons. First, I'm concerning that all of the theories, IR theories, established by or developed by individual scholars. And these individual scholars have a different knowledge, different background, different cultural background, and different belief, and also certainly different academic knowledges. So because of these diversities, I make every individual's theory a little bit different or quite different from the others. So in that way, it's hardly to find anything common shared by the people who have, they definitely share something in common when people have a common background or the same nationalities. So in that way, I will find that the scholars or the theories, actually, they share the common ideas or assumptions, methodologies with a very different cultural background. And for instance, and Qin Yaqing and I, and me, and the academic difference or the theoretical diversity between us is larger than that between me and Morgenthau, or between him and Wendt. So Wendt and Yaqing share more academic ideas, and I think I adhered and I carried out a lot of ideas from the Morgenthau. So in that way, I think it's a not good idea to categorize the IR theories and according to the cultural background. And especially at this moment, the term West is so popular used in academic community. I think that this term West actually mislead a lot of things. First, how can we define the term West? And is Japan belongs to Western society or belong to the Eastern society? And the West politically and no longer, from my understanding, the term of West can no longer apply to the political situation, because the East is already disappeared. When the East is disappeared, how can we know there's a West? So culturally, if we use the West to describe a cultural background, it's harder to tell. Indian, Japan, are they East or the West? And actually, we know that the Indian theorists shares mainly and agree with scholars from the Europe and the US, and the Japanese scholars the same. So if you use a culture, even in terms of a culture, the Western doesn't make sense to me. So I think that this is a wrong concept when they're talking about the China vs. West, or the Chinese school vs. the Western school, or any Western IR theories. I think this is wrong. Just like when this is wrong in terms of typology, because Chinese school is just like an apple, and the Western IR theory means vegetable. You cannot use an apple to compare with a vegetable. You must use a fruit to compare, to categorize with a vegetable. So I think at least the typology is wrong. The second point, and since we discuss about academic school or the theoretical school, we should categorize the school according to assumption. And if not assumption, at least with methodology, right? Since, for instance, we have the British school, and we actually categorize it from the methodology, the perspective of methodology. When we label the realism or liberalism or the constructivism, and actually all of this categorization based on different assumptions. So I think we need a scientific criteria to categorize the group of the IR theories. The last point is that, and I think for Chinese scholars, and they have spent too much time on the term of their ideas, and rather than to develop theories to explain the reality. And many Chinese scholars, they ignore the reality, ignore the international phenomenon, and even ignore the history of China's foreign policy. And why I say that, for instance, when they talk in Shanghai, a group of Chinese scholars said that they developed a theory under the term of symbiosis. Well, symbiosis means both sides serves as a precondition for the existence of the other sides, like a father and the son. And without a son, no one can be parents and children. Without children, no one can become parents. When children disappear, there's no parents, right? Like that. So from my understanding, these people talking about it is not the symbiosis. They talking about the coexistence. Well, that's a totally different concept. peaceful coexistence, or coexistence means you live together, but then you can live separately without neither side as a precondition for the other side. When China disappears from the earth, the US still exists there. When US disappears from the earth, and China still exists there. So this is not this coexist. The existence of the two countries can at most talking about a coexistence, but not a symbiosis. So this misunderstanding of a symbiosis from my side is because there's no content in their theory. They didn't know what they're talking about. They ignore the reality, the facts. So in that way, you find some people even try to develop an IR theory based on China's foreign policy from 1949 to now. The Chinese government have adjusted the foreign policy in many aspects, many times, and every period are so different. Sometimes they contradict with each other. China make alliance in 1950s, and now in 1980s they abandoned the alliance principle. So this contradictory policy is a very a popular universal phenomenon for every country, because the government must adopt a policy according to the change in the international environment. So no one can develop the theory based on government policy and make all of these policies inconsistent with each other. So I think this problem. Finally, I want to wrap up. And nowadays, I think of these. It's understandable for Chinese scholars want to get a name for their theory, like a Chinese school. But I think there's another phenomenon is really troubles me and puzzles me. And many international scholars, they like the term Chinese school very much. And very recently, a Dutch scholar published an article about Chinese school. They think that there's a conspiracy, academic conspiracy behind the Chinese scholars. They try to develop a Chinese school to compete with the US, try to dominate the world with Chinese ideas. I think this is a really misunderstanding about this, what is the theory. I don't think any conspiracy can organize a group of people, develop a school of IR theories. So here, I just want to raise my question to the discussion. Why the Chinese, the term of a Chinese school, Chinese IR school is so attractive to international scholars? Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Professor Yan. That's why you are so popular in Chinese IR. So, in fact, if my memory is correct, you have constantly criticized the use of Chinese school in Chinese IR theory since the year 2006. It's a very short paper that IR theory is universal. And you have repeated your position in your 2018 article, stated Chinese school is something beyond our touch. So you have clarified your position openly to our Western audience. So, but you have left the question to us. So what if Chinese school is not an appropriate term to describe Chinese scholars' last 20 years efforts to construct a non-Western IR theory based on Chinese ancient wisdom or Chinese ancient thought? So what is a question I think leaves to our Western scholars and the following participants to discuss. And in fact, your talk has you know why when Professor Zhang and I has talked about this conference, we think that the main reason is that Chinese scholars never debate with each other. So in Chinese school scholars never debate with each other openly in Chinese academic discourse. So we think we can provide an international platform for us, for Chinese school to debate openly with each other. And then our next speaker is Professor Shih Chih-yu from National Taiwan University to speak on behalf of the relational theory. I know many superb IR theorists, very smart theorists, but Professor Shih is the only one who is good at theory and good at basketball. So Professor Shih, please.
Thank you very much. Can I be heard well?
Yeah.
Yes.
Oh, okay, great. It's great to be here. My special thanks to, of course, Xiao and Lu Peng for organizing this gathering. I would like to take this opportunity to share with you what I consider to be the mission of relational IR in general and Chinese relational IR in particular. The fundamental question of our workshop is, in my opinion, whether in the name of Chinese relational IR, Chinese or relational is more important. In recent years, attempts to transcend China-centrism have been emerging in the Chinese literature. However, these decentralizing efforts have little to do with relational IR elsewhere. I contend that the challenge facing Chinese relational IR is not so much about self-centrism as it is about the capacity to translate critically a different relationality in its own terms. Relational IR studies how relations can both motivate and orient foreign policy. Moreover, it can illustrate how foreign policy can either succeed or fail in linking relational systems to one another. Therefore, relational IR has to be both normative and explanatory. This is because when explaining the purpose and the process of foreign policy, relational IR alludes to the legitimacy of all existing relational systems and the duty of leaders within these systems to get strangers related. That is, on behalf of and in accordance with their own relational systems. With all relational systems facing the task of how to become related with strangers, no relational system can stay within its own boundaries. Chinese relational IR, together with paralleling relational IR elsewhere, is obliged to prescribe ways in which strangers can become related with one another in order for each to remain relationally convincing and sustainable within their own relational system. The existence of a boundary can only cause the demise of relational system unless adherence to a boundary has in fact the opposite goal, that is transcending the present failure to become or remain related. In fact, the Chinese classic and even daily idioms are full of this kind of a contrarian wisdom. Accordingly, relational system cannot help but expand. Still, however, a relational strategy does not seek to substitute, synthesize, or convert another's relationality. Substituting mine for yours is power politics rather than relational politics, and at best reflects the misjudgment that the relations ensue after power. In contrast, Chinese IR generally accepts that power ensues after relations to the extent that first, a relation gives the quest for dominance its meaning or purpose. I actually think Yan Xuetong's book on moral leadership in 2019 is a good reference, although I may have turned his logic upside down. Second, a relation enables mobilization through a network. I think Xiao's work on the institutional building of the AIIB in 2016 is a good reference. Third, a relation breeds either passion or anxiety to correct estrangement and simultaneously empower all relational selves. I think Qin Yaqing's work on relational power and faith in 2016 is a good reference. And fourth, a relation calls for exceptionalism during a crisis, which I think is an ultimate statement of power. And I think Zhang Feng's work on comparative exceptionalism in 2013 is a good reference. Logically, all ostensibly distinctive relational systems will eventually be related. Although this may sound like Francis Fukuyama's End of History or Alexander Wang's World Government, it is actually quite different. In this sense, I agree with Zhao Tingyang's faith that sooner or later, all will arrive at his Tianxia-like consciousness. Although I'm not romantic about Tianxia being inevitably harmonious, I actually think Tianxia can get quite ugly at times since all systems suffer evolution sooner or later. Chinese IR has to answer how this might happen to Tianxia and end, if at all. For all relational systems to become related, their ways of becoming related will have to be mutual, coexistent, and pluriversal. Nowadays, although all relational systems are facing the challenge of total destructions, instead of coexisting relationally, this situation has a lot to do with the expansion of relationality of Westphalia through imperialism and colonialism that emerged as a result of above-mentioned misjudgment that relations ensue after power. Presumably, the relationalities of Westphalia were the first platform to bridge the mutually estranged relational system everywhere, since all relational systems acquire the relationalities of Westphalia to some extent, albeit each in their own way. However, at the moment, no pluriversal exchange is taking place. On the contrary, the white man's burden used to feature dominance and conversion instead of complexity and bridges. Consequently, IR research fails to take advantage of the grand scale of mingling that also takes place in Westphalia to facilitate a pluriversal evolution. In response, almost all relational IRs, including Chinese relationality, result to discursive essentialism and binaries at either the national or international level. In fact, nostalgia for certain relational cosmologies embedded in imagining the geocultural and religious distinctions has been thriving since Amitav Achaya and Barry Buzan's 2007 epochal special issue entitled, "Why is there no non-Western IR theory?" Although these strings of nostalgia are geographically and religiously plural indeed, they are self-defeating in the long run due to their fetish quest for uniqueness and difference. It is unfortunate that this quest is currently flourishing in non-Western, post-colonial, and national IR literature. The effort to retrieve these relational cosmologies, which have usually already been half ruined by the relationalities of Westphalia, is eventually self-defeating if the scholarly posture is to defend the relational system and not to trace, explain, or critically assess the approaches and practices that are already complicating their widespread encountering. At the end of the day, though, a relational approach or theory is not justifiable if people readily accept its rejection outside of their living circles. Once it is realized that relational approach can only survive through getting strangers related successfully, the next stage of relation IR will probably witness critical self-reflection that will expose the need for foreign policy makers to improvise ways to become related with strangers. With its mounting influence and policy engagement, Chinese relation IR can lead recognition of pluriversalism, as Lu Peng once suggested in 2018. I think it's in Pacific Affairs, Pacific Review, by presenting how Chinese foreign policy has learned and unlearned self-centric ways to engage different relational systems. In fact, several attempts to decentralize Tianxia and related to a variety of universalism, especially liberal governmentality, has emerged in the Chinese literature. Given the practical failure of the relationalities of Westphalia to convert other relational systems entirely, alongside the necessity of becoming related between people subscribing to different relational systems in the long run, it is useful to distinguish the following three dimensions of relation in order to analyze how relational systems are disposed to expand. The first dimension is about relationship between the system and the super/nature. The second, between those who belong to the same system. And the third, between different systems. All relational systems probably have all three to ensure their eventually inevitable expansion and coexistence. First, on the foundational dimension, relational cosmologies are almost always composed of imagination of super/natural forces, for example, Tao or God, that justify the evolution of a relational system. Accordingly, all are bound to be related. Second, on the systemic dimension, a minimal degree of consensual resemblance between people, for example, kinship or the rights of nature, with discursive, institutional, and psychological ways of self-reproduction, constitutes all relational selves subscribing to the same system. Even so, estrangement is an inevitable and even recurring cycles anywhere. Third, on the strategic dimension, certain mechanisms to get strangers related, for example, a tributary system or a market system, can adapt to unfamiliar relationalities. In other words, people will be differently related at multiple levels, but may not be consensually related. I wish I could elaborate on these three dimensions and their eventual inevitable expansion and coexistence. Unfortunately, I'm not ready to do it now. Anyway, failure on the last strategic dimension reveals the cosmological hypocrisy that no relation system can survive if its cosmology would appear partial or transient rather than foundational or supernatural. That said, an overcommitment to one's own relational cosmology causes self-defeating rigidity, however powerful it may appear materialistically for the time being. It is the solid but revisable systemic dimension that can support the strategic dimension of pluriversal relationality, with a sense of belonging and solidarity embedded in a certain consensual resemblance. The systemic dimension provides the necessary relational security to engage in extension, exchange, and integration. That's why a degree of self-centrism can be healthy. Polar-versal exchanges rely on people to understand and appreciate how relations other than their own justify things. Cultural translation is the indispensable duty of relational IR, given that systemic relations proceed and evolve each in terms of their own discursive practice. Translative communicationality enables epistemological tourism between relational system and a subsequent appreciation for nuances. On the cosmological dimension, the responsibility of relational IR is, first of all, to establish a linguistic prototype for each relational system that is so foundational and abstract that other relationalities can all coexist harmlessly. To illustrate, elsewhere I've translated Tianxia into a system where all are bound to be related. For the student of Chinese IR, I would also like to translate Westphalia into solidarity embedded in the consensual rights of nature. Both translations are experimental, of course. On the systemic dimension, metaphors can improvise relationship between relational systems by first discovering their possibly imagined intersections. For example, the Christian heaven likened to the Confucian heaven. Second, preparing praxis in another system, for example, painting God in the local image. And or third, accommodating the consensual resemblance of another relationality. For example, ancestor worship conceived of as non-religious convention. To illustrate, I have alternatively suggested elsewhere various forms of gift giving as a cross-cultural metaphor for reviving one's own relational configuration. Consider multilateralism as an alternative to bilateralism and unilateralism on a strategic dimension. The concept used to be unfamiliar to the Confucian relational system. However, it is an everyday concept now. If the Confucian cosmology of Tianxia is appreciable through cultural translation, though, multilateralism means first conforming to the multilateral rules as a gift for other, presumably Western subscribers, so the rules can be relaxed occasionally. And second, insisting that none are left out of a multilateral regime, so exemptions to rules can be allowed for hesitant or incompetent parties. As such, multilateralism prioritizes inclusiveness over rule-based governance. How different multilateralism have been practically related is an agenda for critical cultural translation to push. Currently, the challenge facing Chinese relation IR is, above all, the unavailability of a linguistic prototype. Even if one were available, it cannot really communicate since the relational consciousness of the time is registered in asserting and defending differences. On the other hand, at a strategic level, Chinese foreign policy, the signature of which is presently the Belt and Road initiatives, invokes the metaphor of gift giving to oblige the ironical acceptance of China's territorial self, indicated primarily by pretentiously rigid one China principle. This calls for a critical, that is, emancipative interrogation of the extension of relations and polar-versal exchange of Chinese relation IR. I'll stop here.
Okay, thank you, Professor Shi. Obviously, relational theory in China has two different versions, one in mainland China, one in Taiwan. So Professor Shi's relational theory is obviously more ambitious because we have circulated the reading materials to you that Professor Chen's relational theory is developed from the central question as why could China peacefully rise and integrate into the international system? So Professor Shi's central question is even more universal. I will leave this relational theory to the further discussion in the free discussion part. And since Professor Zhang cannot connect to our room, I was worrying about my technical issue, but Professor Zhang has encountered the technical issue and he cannot join us today. So Professor Zhang Feng, would you please talk about the Chinese school and for us? Thank you.
Sure. Thank you very much, Lu Pen. Can you hear me all right? Good. I would like to begin with a comment on the significance of the field of China's IR theory, followed by a comment on the so-called Chinese school, before focusing on dialogue and cross-fertilization between Chinese and Western theories. We all know that theory is essential to the social world because it structures our perception, understanding, and action. IR theory plays a very important role in world politics, in part because it affects policymaking through such mechanisms. Chinese foreign policy is structured by Chinese policymakers' own theories about various aspects of China's foreign relations. If we take a look at President Xi Jinping's foreign policy discourse, for example, we find a great number of explicit and implicit theories, all tied through the central thread of constructing a so-called community of a shared future for mankind. Most of these theories are normative, but some are empirical, such as a claim that American unilateralism has plunged the world into disorder. Another somewhat peculiar feature of the theory domain in China is that the Chinese government places an extraordinary emphasis on theory as they understand it. We all need to study President Xi Jinping's theory, Xi Jinping thought. And in the Chinese discourse on theory is action guiding and propulsive, very powerful. Every policy is supposed to be based on some theory. So the larger point I want to make here is that as the material world is becoming bipolar or multipolar, here assessments of different scholars vary. The ideational world, or the world of theories, values, and worldviews, is becoming pluralistic. And in this new pluralistic world, Chinese theory is going to be very important in not only affecting Chinese policy, but also through its effect on Chinese policy, the future shape of world order. Scholarly research on Chinese theory by Chinese and non-Chinese scholars alike is therefore going to be significant in both academic and policy terms. So we here in China, scholars here inside China, we hope that the field of Chinese theory will widen and deepen in the years ahead, and that leading journals will carry more articles on this subject. But I also have a niggling worry that the field inside China is not gathering sufficient momentum right now. One reason is that there has been a rising tide of policy research encouraged by the government through the establishment of hundreds of policy think tanks inside and outside of universities. I say this despite the fact that I am myself head of an important think tank in South China. But I worry about this, so I encourage my colleagues to pursue theoretical work, even if they must devote a good part of their time to policy study. With respect to the Chinese School of International Relations, Professor Yan Xuetong said that he is distinctively a minority here, but I don't actually think he is in the minority, because I actually agree with him. I agree with him that it may be a mistake for Chinese scholars to promote a Chinese school. These scholars take the Chinese school as their model, but the development scholars take the English school as their model, but the development of the English school was embedded in a particular historical context, which is not replicable in China today. I think it will be more fruitful for Chinese scholars to build a diversity of Chinese theories rather than a single national school. So Professor Yan's moral realism is one such theory, as are Professor Ren Xiao's Sheng or symbiotic theory and the relational theories of Professor Shi and Professor Qin Yaqin. The next stage of China's theory development, in my view, in addition to building new theories, should focus on dialogue, comparison, and cross-fertilization with Western theories. I can give examples of each of the several prominent Chinese theories that we are familiar with. To begin with Professor Yan's moral realism, I think it can be very fruitfully compared with classical realism. Professor Yan has himself noted the similarity with Morgenthau, but I think he can widen the net to look into Thucydides and Richard Labau. Professor Labau in particular has written an insightful book on classical realism, namely The Tragic Vision of Politics. in which he examined the intersection between ethics and power in classical realism. Second, Chinese writings on the idea of tianxia, whose literal meaning is all in the heaven, especially by the philosopher Zhao Tingyang. Western IR scholars have given Zhao's version of tianxia theory a mostly negative reception, some even equating it with a call for Chinese hegemony. But I think this is too dismissive. Part of the problem, however, lies with Chinese scholars themselves. They are too quick to declare the uniqueness of tianxia thought by claiming that the West has nothing of the sort to offer. In fact, as far as I know, the Western tradition does contain a number of similar ideas. Particularly relevant is the cosmopolitan tradition built around the idea of a world community of free individuals. So there is a fruitful comparison to be made between Chinese tianxia theory and Western cosmopolitanism. Tianxia is not cosmopolitanism, but it is an important kind of globalism. And third, relational theory. The writings of prominent scholars like Professor Shi here and Professor Qing, their writings have cast a spotlight on this strand of Chinese theory. I myself also tried to develop a relational theory of grand strategy in my first book, Chinese Hegemony, which examines the historical East Asian strategic order. But it would be a mistake to claim that China is the unique owner of relationalism. Relationalism is also an important tradition in Western history, although it is true that in modern times, it has been eclipsed by substantialism. Relationalism is rising again in contemporary theorizing, especially in sociological and constructivist theories. So it will be productive for Chinese scholars to draw on those writings. Finally, allow me to briefly report on my own latest theory work. I have completed a book on Sino-American relations with Ned Labau, the Taming Sino-American Rivalry, which was published by Oxford UP last year. I am now writing another book with Ned, comparing Chinese and Western conceptions of international justice and order. And we find a plethora of points of comparison between Chinese and Western thought. Take, for example, principles of justice. In Western thought, the two main principles of justice are equality and fairness. And we're pleased to find that equality and fairness are also central in Chinese conceptions of justice, although they are framed differently. In addition, we find that very interesting comparisons can be made between Chinese and Western thinkers. For example, between Confucius and Socrates and Aristotle, between Xunzi and Plato, between Menzi and Hobbes, between Mozi and Kant, between Han Feizi and Machiavelli, and so on. So such comparative studies will make contributions to the field of international political theory. And I think if Chinese theories are to prosper, comparative studies will be very important. I'll stop here.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor Zhang. Since Professor Zhang is not here, so we will finish the first part of the Chinese scholars presentation, and we enter into the second stage of the conference. We will invite our Western theorists to talk about the Chinese school. So Toni, you are quite lucky, so you can go to bed earlier today. Toni, thank you very much. So first of all, we would like to invite Toni from ANU. We have dreamed in my dream for many times to come back to talk for us. Please, Toni.
Thank you very much, and thank you for the invitation to participate. Can everybody hear me all right? Yes, okay, thank you. One of our suggested discussion topics is the similarities and differences between the Chinese school and so-called Western theories, which is itself an enormous topic. And to make this topic more manageable and to engage with an aspect of the Chinese school, so-called, that I think relates to my own subfield of IR theory, being normative IR theory, I'm going to focus on moral realism in my comments as a contribution to Chinese IR theory alongside what I've previously labeled communitarian realism as an approach to normative IR theory. In the limited time that I have, I'll do 4 things. First, I'll provide a summary of what I understand to be key assumptions that define moral realism within Chinese IR theory. Second, I'll briefly explain the communitarian approach within normative IR theory, an approach that I've labeled communitarian realism and also described in the past as an ethical realist approach. This is an approach that I initially thought would complement and perhaps reinforce moral realism. I'm not as sure about that now, but I'll come back to that point. Third, I'll note some points of convergence and divergence between these 2 different approaches. And fourth, and finally, I'll raise some questions that I have about moral realism as a contribution to Chinese IR theory. So Professor Yan Xuetong draws on ancient Chinese thought to develop a theory of what he calls moral realism. I learned a huge amount from this work, and I'm very grateful to have had the opportunity to engage with it. The term moral realism was actually coined, I understand, by Professor Zhang Feng, my former colleague at the ANU, in his 2012 article, The Qinghua Approach in the Inception of Chinese Theories of International Relations. But Professor Yan has adopted the label to describe his theory in his 2019 Princeton University Press book, Leadership and the Rise of Great Powers. In this recent book, Professor Yan asks why hegemony must decline and why some rising states can achieve their goal of becoming the hegemon while others cannot. He attributes, and I quote, international power transition to the greater capability to reform on the part of the leadership of a rising state than that of the dominant state. And in making this argument, he highlights the relationship between moral action and international influence or international power. He argues, and again, I quote, morality can directly affect the power of states because moral actions increase the legitimacy of a state's leadership, thereby giving that state more influence. Adherence to international moral codes enhances the legitimacy of a leading state's mobilization of support, both at home and abroad, and this raises the state's international power. Professor Yan makes this argument from the perspective of, again, what he calls moral realism. And here I want to focus on some of the key assumptions underlying this proposed position, both to give my Chinese colleagues the opportunity to correct my misunderstandings and to establish a very preliminary starting point for what I hope will be a useful comparison with aspects of normative IR theory that I plan to go on to develop following this discussion. So specifically, I'm interested in how morality is understood as a central tenet of Professor Yan's moral realism. And I'll begin by surveying some key features of Professor Yan's moral realism. So to begin, moral realism is based on the realist assumptions, and I quote from Professor Yan's work, that the pursuit of national interest constitutes the primary motivation for state actions, and international society is an anarchical system wherein self-help is the basis on which all states pursue their particular strategic interests. Moral realism also maintains the importance of morality in any theory of international politics, noting the often neglected aspect of morality in classical realist positions, as Feng also mentioned. Professor Yan quotes E.H. Carr in writing that it is an unreal kind of realism which ignores the elements of morality in any world order. He argues that his moral realism regards morality as of equal importance to policymaking as power, capability, and interests. And Professor Yan also clarifies that for moral realism, morality judgments are made at the governmental level and priority is given to one's own citizens. Morality judgments can be made, he argues, at one of three levels: personal, governmental, and international, and moral realism focuses on this governmental level. He uses an interesting example in the context of the current pandemic in setting out what this means. He argues that the state leader is expected to enact policies that will provide health care for all citizens of the state, yet at the same time, no one expects a state leader to be concerned about the healthcare issues of other nationals. He emphasizes that discussion in this book of morality refers solely to governmental morality, whereby leaders' actions will be judged according to the accepted codes of conduct pertaining to national interests and national capability. The government's responsibility to the country it represents and the people it governs is the core of governmental morality. And as the final feature of moral realism that I will highlight here, Professor Yan also argues that moral realism is based on universally accepted codes. And this, I think, is the feature that I found at first more surprising alongside the others and also incredibly interesting. He specifies that the components of morality can be categorized as national and universal codes. Professor Yan writes that my theory defines the morality of political leadership at the universal level rather than at the national level. He goes on to maintain that differing from national morality, such as American, Chinese, or Japanese political culture, universal morality is accepted by all members, even adversaries, of a given international system. Therefore, we will use universal codes to judge the morality of a state's leadership. Governmental morality thus refers to those universal moral codes. And I quote again, when the state's actions accord with universally accepted codes, it is deemed moral. And when the reverse is true, it is deemed immoral. Thus, determining whether or not the action of a state is moral entails an assessment of that action according to universally accepted codes. Professor Yan acknowledges, and again I quote, that the existence of universally accepted moral codes may at first glance seem to disregard cultural differences and so evoke worries about imperialistic tendencies. Yet he states quite starkly that humans are evolutionarily predisposed to morals and to being moral, and the moral foundation is the same across the species. It is because morality is built on shared moral foundations, he argues, that we're able to agree to these international moral codes. Now I want to turn briefly to my own subfield of normative IR theory. Now the subfield of IR theory in which I situate my own work is normative IR theory, also variously known as international political theory and international ethics. And this body of work draws on a rich combination of arguments, distinctions, and concerns from political theory, moral philosophy, and IR. It encompasses a variety of approaches and theories that nevertheless share the aim of exploring moral expectations, decisions, and dilemmas in world politics. And positions within normative IR theory thereby distinguish themselves from other theoretical approaches to international relations by directly and openly broaching questions of morality. I think that this body of work contains positions that are directly relevant to Professor Yan's moral realism. Specifically, there are important points of contact between so-called communitarian positions within normative IR theory, specifically a position that I've labeled communitarian realism in earlier work and described as an ethical variation on realism. Yet I have to acknowledge that this relationship isn't as straightforward as I thought it would be when I started reading Professor Yan's important work, and this creates some interesting puzzles for me. I'll try to survey communitarianism quickly, perhaps too quickly, but I can come back perhaps in the discussion to further points. According to communitarian positions, membership in particular communities and participation in their practices are morally defining. Normative IR theory has taken the term communitarianism from political theory, although the position underwent a slight transformation during the process of adoption. Specifically, the communitarian stance within normative IR theory is characterized in a way that treats the morally defining community and the state synonymously. The resulting points of contact with those classical realist positions that espouse often overlooked ethical stances mean that we might usefully refer to this state-centric variation as communitarian realism. Now I want to turn quickly to some points of convergence and divergence between these two approaches. In terms of convergence between moral realism as a contribution to Chinese IR theory and what I've called communitarian realism, both acknowledge the importance of morality in explaining and understanding international politics, and both moral realism and what I've called communitarian realism grant priority to fellow citizens and the interests of one state. For communitarian realism, this priority is justified because the state is the community that defines what the philosopher Alistair MacIntyre calls one's moral starting point. And this brings me to the divergence between the two. According to communitarian realism, morality is defined in terms of the shared understandings, the relationships, and practices of the particular community or state. Culture matters, relationships within the community are morally defining, and the source of morality is particularistic. As I've covered, by contrast, moral realism claims allegiance to a moral starting point outside any particular community or state. It claims a universal moral code and a universally shared moral foundation. And this surprised me. I expected to find that a moral realism inspired in part by traditional Chinese philosophy would be a relational, particularistic ethic. I was wrong, and I'm in equal parts fascinated as well as grateful for being introduced to this work and perplexed. So I still have some questions, and I'll conclude with two questions, if I may. First, the 2019 book ends with a section predicting changes in the international order over the next decade. Professor Yan states that all scientific theories have the function of prediction. Conversely, a theory able to be used for prediction should be a scientific theory. The clear assumption is that moral realism is a scientific theory, yet little is said about methodology in the book. And this left me wondering what is meant by scientific theory here, and how this account relates to its explicit inspiration in traditional Chinese philosophy on the one hand, and its commitment to a universal moral code on the other. My second question relates to the relationship between the source and the scope of moral positions. Now, moral realism itself, I don't think presents a contradiction because it combines the assumptions of IR's realism with explicit ethical commitments. Indeed, a student of classical realism would not find this combination surprising, and a scholar who situates herself within the subfield of normative IR theory would be familiar with sophisticated arguments that can explain and defend this alignment between realist assumptions and a sophisticated, I think, compelling ethical perspective. However, following my first reading of this work, there does seem to be a tension in moral realism. Namely, how can the moral realist approach, which appeals to national interest and prioritizes one's own state and citizens, be reconciled with explicitly universal moral codes? And this is something I'd like to look into further. And if there are any responses to that in the discussion, I'd be grateful. Thank you very much.
You have very careful read of Professor Yan's work. And since Toni will leave us quickly very soon, it's quite late in Australia. So Professor Yan, would you like to make a very brief response to the two questions?
Well, actually, I didn't get the questions, but through these comments and discussion, I want to make two points. And the first, I think the rational theories is a normative theory, and try to tell people what we should do. But the moral realism is a scientific theory, and personally, I regard it like that. And the theory cannot tell people what they should do, just tell the law behind people's behavior, the behavior of states. And if the states behave inconsistent with the law, they can achieve the goal. If the violence, their policy is opposite against the law, and they have a more chance to be beaten. So the failure, that's one thing. So I think there's a big difference between scientific theory and normative theory. The second, and because moral realism is claimed to be scientific theory, it must be face the test by history. That means they can not only summarize and the experience in the history, but also have to prepare to be tested by the future. So in that way, from my understanding, the moral realism in some way can apply for prediction. That means if you behave according to this the regulation, the law of the social law of the international politics, and then you will be rewarded by the history, otherwise will be punished by the history. So in that, I think that this is also a big difference between the scientific theory and the normative theory. The last point I want to say, and thank you, Toni, for your so careful reading of my work. And also, I think your explanation is much more clear than what I wrote in the book. And I would say that actually nowadays, normative theory and have a big problem to me is that most people will say, okay, we know what is good. And then the question, how can we achieve that? This is a problem for normative theory. And normative theory usually tell the people what you should, and then what you can get. But the question is that people said, why I should do according to your suggestion? And if there's no punishment, and then they said, oh, without the risk of being punishment, why I should accept your suggestion? I think that's a problem. So for realism, I always consider punishment is a very important mechanism, and people do not want to be punished. And according to that, that means morality, the concept of morality used the moral realism is not that ethnic. It's an instrumental concept. Means you behave morally, and then you will gain benefits to yourself. So it's not an altruism idea of morality. So in most cases, morality is always a value-oriented term. But in the moral realism, morality is used as an instrumental concept. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Toni. Thank you, Professor Yan. And next we'll invite Peter to, Peter has prepared a very interesting chart for us to locate the branches of Chinese school in its place. So Peter, please, and I will show the chart for where to show it. Can you see the chart?
Yes, yes.
Okay.
Good, yeah. So thank you very much for inviting me. I gave my paperlet a title, which Lu Peng kindly informed me had been used 3 times by Chinese scholars. So that establishes how ignorant I'm in this field. But just to start off with, I do not take for granted that this meeting can be attended by all. I think it takes particular courage in different parts of the world to attend meetings like these days. And I do not take for granted that we talk English and not Chinese. I'm always overwhelmed by my ignorance when I talk to Chinese scholars who are amazingly fluent in English, and I'm amazingly ignorant in Chinese. And that puts an enormous burden on my Chinese colleagues to explain to me, the idiot, in another language what they are trying to convey. And I think this is, I will come back to this, this is not a minor thing. In my paper, I managed to misspell Xi's name 4 times, I think. Xiu, I promise you when I'm finished, I will get your name right, okay? But having Xiu as part of the Chinese school in this meeting makes the meeting for me intellectually really interesting. Because I think China is a whole lot more than the People's Republic of China. I've written about that in my book on Sinicization. I think the overseas Chinese community is enormously important. It makes China a global power in a way in which the Chinese government doesn't appreciate. So having Xiu here articulating a relational worldview which is different from one centered in Sinocentrism, I think is enormously helpful. I read that little paper 4 or 5 times. I realized I haven't read the book from 2019. And when that paper was just read to me, it was all over my head because it is analytically abstract and incredibly rich. But I think it's very exciting that Xiu is here. So I wanted to briefly talk about the source of this graph. After 2008, I wondered why the financial crisis was such a surprise. And I learned to my surprise in 3 papers, which I wrote with a former student of mine, Steve Nelson, that economists and central bankers had run uncertainty as a concept out of town. We were living in a world of risk. Now that was a pretty crazy idea, I thought, but that is what political economy believed. And for that reason, political economy as a field had nothing to say about the financial crisis of 2008. After these papers, I realized that it was not just a matter of economists, that in fact, the neglect of uncertainty marred the field of international relations. And I wrote a long paper with a former student of mine who very sadly died, Lucia Seibert, on what I called protean power. That paper I could not publish. It was rejected by all journals. And so I decided to make that into a book with 12 case studies. The theory chapter was finally, the gist of the theory chapter was finally published by ISQ, but only over special pleading, saying that it was too insulting not to publish what became a book. I then went around and gave probably 24 talks. And the first question, there was a stunned silence. You know, basically the core argument of the book is that the world is not just described by Hobbes, it's also described by Machiavelli. The world is not just one of probability, it is also one of potentiality or fortuna, a very old idea. So the world we see is not the world as it is. The world is full of potentialities which get mobilized at particular moments for political effects. I didn't make the claim in the book that the world was only potentiality. I was saying, no, it's a matter of risk and uncertainty. And you have to make judgments about particular situations, what the balance is. So the book was in largely shifting the burden of proof to those who said, it's only Hobbes, it's only risk. So in these talks, you know, there was an embarrassed silence. And then the first question unfailingly was, this is very interesting. Let me try to translate what you are saying into my language. And the language unfailingly was a Newtonian language. It was unfailing in trying to capture the idea of uncertainty and fortuna into the notion of probability, risk, and control. And that gave me the idea that, in fact, what we're having is a deep epistemological problem, that we are all Newtonians. So that's the story behind this graph. So let me take the next few minutes to go through the graph and then illustrate it by talking about moral realism. I have talked about relational theory in the book, which is coming out on uncertainty and discontents, worldviews, and world politics. So the basic point, I think, is that Chinese IR scholars, American IR scholars, European IR scholars are all Newtonian humanists. They're all in the top left quadrant. There are few exceptions. Milja Kurki, who is in this audience, wrote a daring book which takes relationalism much further. She cashes in on scientific cosmology, Lee Smolin's work, and translates it for international relations theory. Okay? It's a brilliant, daring work. It's counterintuitive, and it's fundamentally right. I got to this book and to Milja's work by having read into quantum mechanics. Quantum mechanics and scientific cosmology are mutually contradictory, but they have a very enlarged view of what the world is like. So the debates in Chinese IR and the debates in American IR are all on the left-hand side of this graph. They are between substantialist or relationalist conception of the world. And Gongsheng and Tianji are theorizing, they span these two. They span the two quadrants in this graph, but they are a mixture of something which you will find in American European scholarship. There's nothing distinctive Chinese about it. So this Newtonianism is really, we discuss worldviews in IR in the terms and language of paradigms. And the analytical paradigms of the last generation are either substantialist, Xiao mentioned it, or relationalist. So that's the first dimension. The second dimension, and there's this term hyperhumanism. It's a very unfortunate term. I created it myself. It means beyond humanism. It doesn't mean without humanism. There are many other terms. Let me just read some of them. Post-humanism, transhumanism, anti-humanism, meta-humanism, the new materialism. I didn't like any of those. So I called it hyperhumanism because it places the human in its larger context. Let me read one paragraph. Contrary to the Newtonian worldview of the world as a closed system, scientific cosmology and quantum mechanics view the world as an open system. Contra Newton, space is not a flat background condition with coordinates filled by thing-like objects, such as particles or planets, that move according to the logic of universal laws of motion. Even though relativity and quantum theories have shown background-independent theorizing to be plainly wrong, Lee Smolin, following Milja, suspects that many scientists still hope to gain access to eternally valid laws of the universe. Yan was just saying, he is very much committed to the scientific model, the if-then hypothesis, spoken as a true Newtonian. Maybe they have lost confidence in Newton's laws, but not in the idea of laws. Mathematics is a powerful tool in the endeavor of finding the universal and eternal. But the problem with mathematics is that it looks at things at the universe from the outside, as if things were moving against a neutral background that simply doesn't exist. Smolin argues that a single, open, and causally complex cosmos comprises the universe, but nothing exists beyond it. The universe is what it has evolved into being, specifically networks of relationships in time. We are all in and of the universe and not in or of anything else. So this idea of hyperhumanism means that we are part of the universe and we don't represent it. We have evolved in it. And that is the deep notion of relationality. And my intuition is that she is talking about that, and therefore that he would be spanning the bottom half of this graph, but I'm not sure about it. I have to think about it more and talk to him. So if there is no Chinese IR theory, and this is the second part of this little paper, I applied it to moral realism. I just read Jonathan Krasner's definitive takedown of American IR realist theories. He's a classical realist, and Yan Xuetong's work fits perfectly into classical realism, as Toni has already said. So I think that's it's a wonderful home to be, and focusing on walls. And Mearsheimer is, I think it's politically understandable, it's intellectually understandable because they were hegemonic in American IR. But as Krasner shows the devastating effect, it's oligopolistic theory with indeterminate outcomes applied to politics. And therefore it's totally useless. So moral realism is part of the classical realist tradition. Now, what's distinctive about it, and Toni's wonderful remarks showed a depth of knowledge which I do not have, is it's contextual and textual. That is what's distinctive for the Tsinghua school, is to have read the old texts. IR scholars don't do that normally. Only political theorists do this, okay? And it takes a particular respect for text to do it. So the Cambridge School of which I know just a tiny bit, worries a great deal about the relationship between text and context. And I don't think moral realism worries a great deal about it. It uses the translations in a particular way. Let's just call it, Bell has this wonderful article where it talks about the interpretive and canonical, stipulative and canonical interpretive protocols, which Yan Xuetong relies on. I'll just say it's sort of translating it literally from 2,000 years ago into today. Well, maybe that's true, but I assume that the Cambridge School would have a very productive intellectual engagement with the Tsinghua School on how to deal with the relation between text and context. Again, this is nothing specific to moral realism or the Chinese school of IR. This is what scholars have worked up. You could do the same move by going to Reinhard Koselleck, which a much more dynamic concept of how conceptual history moves across time. The Tsinghua school seems to me very static in its approach to concepts. So again, nothing particular to Chinese IR. Finally, I think Yan Xuetong is a political entrepreneur. It isn't that he's sitting there wanting to read ancient texts. He's sitting there wanting to read ancient texts to change people's minds about a smart, wise, humane, whatever you want to call it, Chinese foreign policy. It's a project penetrated by politics. So his understanding of science, that is Newtonian science, with a if-then stipulation, the belief in laws, all the things which a hyperhumanist, scientific cosmology or quantum mechanics would not understand to be science. He believes that there's science in the singular, as most of my American colleagues do. This is clearly not right. The Newtonian system is a subset of a larger system. So modelers, I recently read this book by Clarks and Primo, okay? And it talks about the two traditions of modeling. The old one was, syntactic modeling, and it worried about how do you relate a model and the theory to the reality and get to data to test the model. Well, modern modelers are semantic modelers. They don't think it's a story of what if. It's not a story of if then, if this, then that. They're saying, no, modeling is what if. If you believe the model to be the story, then, if you believe that 2,000 years ago, Chinese philosophers were telling us something which is relevant for Chinese foreign policy today, then the following happens. It's like children playing. It's make-believe. It's making up a world. That's what modelers do. And where do they gain their authority? Well, I think if you are a make-believe modeler in Beijing today, you've got a whole lot more authority behind yourself than if you're a make-believe modeler in Copenhagen. So that's just a fact. So I think this understanding of science and the universality which is implied, and I think which Yan Xuetong is arguing for, is fundamentally mistaken if you enlarge your understanding of science. So the notion that science, that there is a dualistic theory of science, with Dilthey started, Dilthey being the great humanist, right? And which the Chinese school deeply believes in, I think has to be rethought once you enlarge your understanding what science is. So in all these dimensions, I think the Tsinghua school is in a very productive relation and talk with other schools. And I think this is all to the good. I don't see this as a criticism at all. This is what scholars do. So this is an example. I will give other examples in the full paper coming to the same point. There is no Chinese IR school of theory. So what other conclusions? Well, I think we have to let go of the dualistic notion of science. And finally, coming back to my own hobby horse, despite of all of our theoretical sophistications, we're all blind, tapping our cane against the pavement as we seek to fathom what will happen next. Take the pandemic. I, for one, do not believe that the pandemic will be largely solved by the end of this year. What's happening in India now is a catastrophe beyond Wuhan in New York. It's going to be much worse. And of course, it's the breeding ground for mutants, which will hit back at China and the United States, the original two culprits of this pandemic. Do I know this? Can I attach probability figures? No, I don't. But it's my intuition in the era of uncertainties. We live in an era of heightened uncertainty that makes the hard Newtonianism of deterministic laws and the soft Newtonianism of risk-based reasoning a less useful navigational tool for both Chinese IR scholars seeking guidance in the distant past and American IR scholars searching the past for new data. But if historians and semantic modelers are right, the past is never distant, always open to reinterpretation. It is, like the future, unpredictable. Thank you.
Thank you, Peter. I view these comments and suggestions on Chinese school as an encouragement of its future development. I think I'm not qualified to comment on your suggestions, but I would like to provide one interesting things here for the following Western theorists. We all say that the Chinese school, regardless whether the term is appropriate or not, we all say the Chinese school started from the year 2000. We all counted back to Professor Zhang Xiao's paper in 2000, which calls for the Chinese school. But we know that in the year 2000, there is another paper similarly called for a Chinese school, but for the political purpose as to resist against the Western invasion, Western academic hegemony. So it's obviously a kind of political oriented Chinese school. And fortunately, in the last 20 years, we witnessed the growing of academic oriented Chinese school, and which has yielded 3 or 4 branches of Chinese school. So I view all these Western response to Chinese school as a kind of encouragement to the academic-oriented Chinese school. And thank you, Peter. Next, we will invite Barry to talk about the Chinese school. So Barry is very special in the development of Chinese school. He has debated with Chinese scholars in the year 2010 and 2014 regarding the peaceful possibility of the peaceful rise of China, and has, in my view, has accelerated the coming into being of a relational theory, at least of Professor Qin Yaqin's thought. So Barry, please.
Thanks, Lupang, and thanks for having me. The way you introduced me at the beginning there might make people think I'm going to talk about the Chinese school and the English school, but I've said everything I have to say about that in the paper I wrote with Wang Zhangli a few years ago. So I'm not going to talk to that. I'm going to do some fairly simple things, and I'm going to speak quite frankly on the basis of the fact that, as you just mentioned, I've had the privilege of watching all of this unfold, watching from outside, and like Peter, I have the same handicap that the Chinese language is a mystery to me. So that shapes my view in a very particular way, and you will have to indulge me for that. But I think it's perhaps useful to think about how this idea of a Chinese school got rolling in the first place, to sort of take a bit of a look back, because especially in the way that Qin Yaqin tried to do it, the way I understood his project there was that he was saying, we've spent the 1980s and the 1990s kind of getting to know Western theory from having been completely cut off from it for a while. So we've had to absorb a lot and read a lot, and we kind of got to terms with it, and we learned how to apply it and such like. And now it's time that we begin to think for ourselves. So that was, in a sense, the project around which the label Chinese school was conceived. And it was therefore an empty signifier. Now, it seems to me that that kind of empty signifier is a thing that Chinese people like to do, right? To float a big concept of some sort with no content in it, but then to see what happens, to see how it gets filled up. And if it gets filled up well, I mean, things like Peaceful Rise or the Belt and Road Initiative, when first spoken of, don't mean very much, but eventually people fill them up and they either fly or they don't. So it's originally empty. The problem it originally addressed is, in a sense, no longer there. As we're all sitting here, we know there's plenty of Chinese IR theory, or things that think of themselves as IR theory, and which at least some other people in the field think of as being theory. This raises a bit the question of is it Chinese or is it just theory, and how do you make sense of that? Now, I have a rather particular way of making sense of that, which some of you might not agree with, but I think it will be, Yan Xuetong is not going to like this, but I think it will be, in a sense, the way that outsiders tend to see the Chinese school. Okay? Because outsiders basically have next to zero interest in the turf wars going on in China amongst the different individuals who are trying to set up their own schools. Nobody could care less about that, and the details of it don't interest all that many people. Right? Just as the details of academic turf wars in any country are not of that much interest, except to those who are engaged in them. It seems to me that what goes forward with the label Chinese school might be understood in terms of, say, what would international relations as a discipline look like if it had been invented in China? Right? It was invented in the West, and it looks very Western, and it's full of Western history and Western political theory and all that. So, what would it look like if, in some imaginary alternative history, this discipline had been invented in China? Well, it would thereby, in the way that Western IR has done, it would draw on Chinese history, and it would draw on Chinese political philosophy and political theory, and it would build up theories about international relations on that basis. And it would probably look somewhat different, given the differences in Chinese history and Chinese political theory. It would probably look somewhat different from what came out of Western IR. If you take that as being, in a sense, the central meaning of the Chinese school, that it's international relations thought of through Chinese history and through Chinese political theory, then whilst Chinese people have a comparative advantage in doing this, because they come with the language, as it were, they don't have a monopoly on it. The language can be acquired by others, and outsiders can, as it were, also become practitioners of a Chinese school by this definition. So this definition would, I'm afraid, lump together Yan Xuetong and his Tsinghua colleagues and Jin Yanqing and the Tianxia approach as well, because they all draw exactly on those particularly Chinese resources. I'm not so sure about Ren Xiao's Gongsheng or symbiosis theory, that it seems to me could have come from other than Chinese sources. And I wasn't very convinced by his ability to link it to classical Chinese tribute system. I know he doesn't like the term, but I mean, it feels in its approach like some aspects of the English school, like some aspects of liberal institutionalism, and even a bit like, if you go back very far, to John Hertz's work in 1950 on self-limiting nationalism. So that seems to me a theory that doesn't necessarily have Chinese roots. It might do, but not obviously. I don't think the Chinese school is about the rise of China. I think that would be a kind of entire waste of the opportunity of the idea. You can look at the rise of China with all kinds of existing theories. You don't need a Chinese school to do that. It would be interesting to know what people who are in or around the Chinese school, how they think that Marxism fits into this. Marxism would seem to be almost by definition not part of a Chinese school, and it doesn't seem to appear there. There are also quite distinguished Chinese scholars like, say, Tang Shiping with his theory of social evolution, who never get mentioned in this context. Now, I'm not quite sure whether that's to do with the baronial politics, the turf wars inside Chinese IR. Probably it is. If you look back in British IR history, you can find all kinds of personality conflicts and things like that that explain who's in and who's out of the English school or whatever. So there's a question here, which I think it's not so much about a Chinese school of IR. There are lots now of people doing IR theory in China, but it's about the particular sources of what they're trying to do, and whether they're trying to use those sources to, in a sense, to modify and question the existing framing of IR, or in some way to replace it. Okay, so that's my kind of general view of where the Chinese school came from and what it might still mean. I don't think it any longer has the purpose that Chen Yaqing put to it, because that need is no longer there. The Chinese IR has moved on since then. Okay, with that said, I want to look at what I think are two particular difficulties for the Chinese school going ahead. And I'm going to be, as I said, a bit frank about this. The first one arises from the concern, which seems mainly to be expressed by Lu Peng, about Sinocentrism being an issue for the Chinese school, or for Chinese thinking about IR in general. This is a difficult thing to handle, in the sense that, to some extent, a degree of Sinocentrism is necessary to get a project like this off the ground, because the IR that China and its scholars have encountered is very much Western rooted. I mean, it is, to be somewhat oversimplifying, it is little more than Western history and Western political theory conjured up into a theory of international relations, which doesn't really take all that much account of the way things have worked in the rest of the world. So to break into this, there has to be a degree of egocentrism. The danger, of course, is that you end up trying to replace one distorted view of the world with another, which doesn't help anybody. So there's a fine line to be walked here, and this, it seems to me, is one of the difficulties. If you accept the definition of the Chinese school that I gave, then one of the difficulties of pursuing this in a global IR context is that China's history and political theory were all, or pretty much all, happened and were made in a system which had only one civilization. And that is not the situation that China is now in, and it's not the situation that the world is in. And this, it seems to me, is something that needs more focus than it gets, that it needs to be worked out, because, and I think that's why it addresses Lu Peng's concern with Sinocentrism, okay? Because there was something quite novel about the circumstances of China, and that this is true whether you see China as an actor in a wider system of some sort, or whether you see China occasionally, as in its various warring state periods, as being a kind of international system of its own. And depending on which of those you look at, you get a very different view of Chinese history. Okay? So that would be one of the difficulties. I have occasionally the rather subversive thought, which came to mind because I recalled the book written in 1966 by William Fulbright, an American senator, on the arrogance of power. And his topic was the arrogance of American power. It does seem to me that if China moves or gets kind of caught up in its own sinocentrism, this will create a great opportunity for someone to write a book with the title, The Arrogance of Power with Chinese Characteristics. And one begins to see, as it were, the scope for that opening up. So that's one issue. The other one is one that I flagged in a piece that I wrote in the Chinese Journal of International Politics in 2018 on the problems of developing IR theory anywhere. And this is the difficulty of doing IR theory from inside an authoritarian state. It makes it, in terms of joining the world and getting taken seriously by the rest of the world, it makes a steeper hill to climb if you're working from inside an authoritarian state. Now, nothing you can do about that, that's where you are. Right? But it does create particular kinds of problems, I think, because IR as a discipline has always the dual function of both advising the prince and speaking truth to power. And these two things are contradictory. And it's easier to do the first than to do the latter if you're inside an authoritarian state. So there's a real problem for Chinese IR. And I'm not suggesting that there's an easy solution to this. It's very difficult to handle. But it's very easy from the position that you're in to have the work that you do be perceived as towing the government line in some way. The difficulty here is that, although, as you all know, I think there's a lot of very good work going on inside China. The question is how to get it out and how to get it into the mainstream. And this is not straightforward. We don't have to dwell, I think, on the more blatant examples of this, where Xi Jinping's thought is featured as the main idea. That has echoes of Mao and Stalin, and that would, I think, then replicate the failure of other authoritarian states within which some interesting thinking about IR went on. Think of Nazi Germany or the Soviet Union. They didn't really get their thinking, or indeed Japan, come to that, they didn't really get their thinking out to the rest of the world because it was looked upon as being towing the government line. This can be a really difficult problem. And I would take, and I'll finish with this, I take as one of the kind of particular examples of how difficult this is to handle, the way in which academic work portrays China as somehow inherently peaceful. Now, maybe it is. You could possibly make that case, and others not necessarily inside China have done so, like Dave Kang. But it's not a straightforward case, and it hangs very much on whether you're looking at China's international relations as China as a unit playing with other units, or you're looking sometimes at China as in its warring state period as being an international system in itself. So a case can be made that China in its international environment has been relatively peaceful. But if you look at China as an international system in its warring state periods, it's incredibly violent. Right? And these things need to be talked about. It seems to me that there's a real danger in the too easy portrayal of China as necessarily peaceful. Now, this is an entirely unfair remark, I know, because you can think of lots of American liberals who go out of their way to present the United States as being peaceful because it's liberal. Right? So this is something that is done in other places as well. But I'm not saying that life is fair. But it does seem to me that operating from within inside an authoritarian state, you've got a steeper hill to climb and need to be aware of that in order to get Chinese IR theory out into the rest of the world. And particularly so for Chinese IR theory as the way I've described it, as that which has its roots and origins in Chinese history and Chinese political theory. So that's my lot. Thank you.
Thank you, Barry. You are not satisfied, you are dissatisfied with not only the title, but also the task of the Chinese school. So thank you very much for that. And thank you for reminding me of the sinocentrism issue. I think it's something that inheritedly existed in every discipline. We have Western IR, Eurocentrism in Western IR theory. You have sinocentrism in Chinese IR theory. I think it's something that cannot be eliminated thoroughly. And now we'll talk about later in the free discussion. But before that, Beate, do you mind if I feel quite guilty to see Krasner here, because I think you are supposed not to be here. It's quite early for you. So Beate, if you do not mind, because I feel quite so guilty inside in my mind. So Beate, if you don't mind, would you mind if we invite Krasner to talk first?
No, it's okay. Go ahead with your original schedule. I'm fine. I'm going to sit.
Okay. I feel quite guilty because you are supposed to be here 3 hours later. So it's quite early. So it's quite early in your time. I'm sorry for that. I'm really sorry for that. So Beate, and please.
Okay. Let me just change my view
Okay.
so I don't stare at myself all the time. Okay. Thank you very much for inviting me to this workshop. I'm not an expert on China or on Chinese international theory, but I've nevertheless found it very fruitful to engage with this material. Partly because, of course, I've learned a lot about Chinese theoretical contributions to our field, and partly because this entire project of developing Chinese international relations theory or theories speaks directly to my intellectual interest in the history and politics of knowledge. So I'm going to take that politics of knowledge approach as my starting point for a few reflections. I will start with trying to identify two very broad key aims of this entire project. And I will then, in my second and third sections, talk a little bit about in how far those two aims are being sort of reached by Chinese, but also of Western IR theories. And I will end up with the suggestion of maybe to follow on from Barry of how one might climb that steep hill. Okay, so what are the key aims of trying to develop Chinese international theory? I think the debate about this clearly recognizes the close relationship between power and knowledge. We have this when we read through this material. I understand that under the, under Mao's rule, social sciences were abolished and international relations therefore also. And after 1979 in China, you then get support for the development of social science and international relations thinking and so on. And of course, we know this also from the West. Famously, the US government had huge interest in knowledge about international relations after the Second World War and supported the relevant academic development. And then, of course, this is not a one-way street. Academic analyses are, of course, often motivated by the issues and problems of the time and of the place, of course, and these academics aim to inform political practice. So in the West, for example, at the end of the 19th and the beginning of the 20th century, we have theories dealing with, or reflections on international relations, dealing with colonial administration, imperialism, race relations, and things like that. And conversely, within the colonies, we have the development of Hindu theories of international relations and so on, that were all supposed to sort of establish the case for independence. So in all these cases, knowledge is used to justify certain forms of political power, to challenge particular power relations, and those power relations in turn inform, prop up, and validate certain forms of knowledge. And of course, I think this is also true for this case of developing Chinese international theory. And I think this project has two key goals. One of them is intellectual and the other one is political. The intellectual part is, starting from the assumption that Western forms of international relations, exclude the perspectives, resources, and so on of other actors, less powerful actors in the international system. And as a result of that, they're relatively narrow and not, as generally valid and representative as they should be. So what the aim in intellectual terms of developing a Chinese international school or international theory is, of course, to produce a better international theory by adding into perspectives that have been excluded beforehand, and that would then hopefully sort of lead to a more encompassing, inclusive understanding of how international relations work. The second aim, I think, is a political one, and this basically takes its starting point from the fact that particular forms of power are supported by particular forms of knowledge, that therefore Germany, Western theories of international relations are, has to be challenged if unequal and hegemonic forms of Western power in international relations should be challenged. So we have, I think, those two very broad aims. Now, let me look at in how far I think that both Chinese and Western international theories actually managed to reach these goals. So first, do Chinese theories integrate neglected viewpoints and resources and thus produce international theories with a greater sort of general validity? And I would say at a first glance, the answer must be yes, because clearly, when we look at moral realism, it basically adds or integrates a moral dimension to broadly realist conceptions. So it adds something here. Relational theory does clearly replace an individualist rationality with a relational rationality. And the same is true for symbiotic theory that basically integrates an ability to deal with difference in international relations. So in that sense, it looks on the theoretical side as if these are quite successful projects. But at the same time, when we compare this with Western theories, we find that there are quite a lot of parallels, of course. So as several people have already pointed out today, realist theories are, of course, not entirely lacking of moral considerations. They're already in there with Morgenthau, with Niebuhr, and other people. It is also the case, as relational theorists in China themselves point out, that critical theories in the West, especially feminism and post-colonialism, are actually working on the basis of relational foundations. So this is not new either. And Gongsheng theory is being pointed out is like the concept of symbiosis, which was developed by a German botanist in the 19th century and is now being found also in environmental thought. So in this very general form, there's nothing particularly Chinese about morality, relationalism, or symbiosis. Those can all be found in Western theories as well. This does not mean, of course, that doing it from the Chinese point of view is useless at all, because it challenges the Western monopoly of knowledge production. It basically points out that there are highly sophisticated resources for reflecting on international relations in Chinese history, and not just in Western history, and especially that they're also there before they are there in Western history. But I would say it reduces sort of the Chinese credentials to, or the Chinese contribution to an adding of Confucius to Hobbes or Taoism to dialectics. The solution to this problem is not necessarily, I think, to deal with the much more detailed forms of these theories, because when we get down to the more detailed level, what we find is that then these theories get much too narrow for any broader appeal that they might have. Yeah. So first, it's unclear whether, how, and to what extent classical Chinese thought actually genuinely underpins contemporary political reflections in China, especially if we consider radical ruptures in Chinese history, from the century of humiliation to the Maoist period. Second, Chinese theories are as vulnerable as Western theories are to the particular interests and perspectives of the context in which they are being produced, and this is the contemporary Chinese state. And this may also, as other people have pointed out, and Barry too just recently, may narrow their broader appeal and general validity. And third, one has to ask, you know, who or what is included or excluded in such a unitary conception of Chinese theory. Do these theories represent the thinking of ethnic and religious minorities in China? Do they represent the huge Chinese diaspora around the world? Do they represent the reflections of Chinese women at home or abroad? So it's unclear how much of the diverse Chinese historical experience, how many of the diverse sections of Chinese society, and which of the many Chinese political interests and viewpoints these theories actually represent. So, you know, the goal of providing a better, in the sense of more inclusive international theory, I think is still facing the challenge of providing a highly inclusive conception of what is actually Chinese. And I'll return to that later on. First, the second question, the second key goal that I've raised in the beginning, which is how far do Chinese theories of international relations serve to challenge the hegemony of Western international thought and the hierarchical international order that is assumed to be propped up by it? Now, again, when we look at the theories in the abstract, we can see clearly that they do identify clearly weaknesses in Western international thought. So the role of power in realist theory is no doubt playing a very important role in justifying hierarchical international relations. The role of individual rationality in constructivist thought and other mainstream IR theories clearly plays a role in as an area of of the West are, you know, extremely negative in terms of a fair and just and inclusive international system. So, but despite these promising theoretical moves, it's not clear that these theories actually do challenge the hegemony of Western theories in the field or the political hegemony of the West in international affairs. And again, when we look at Western theories in comparison, we have to say that they don't fare much better at all. Yeah, we have said before that you know, we have symbiotic thinking, critical theories with relational foundations, normative international theory, as we heard from Toni earlier. All of this exists in the West, and none of it is particularly influential. And this, And this is not even just because these are, marginal, hippie-like things that are going on. Actually, the problem pertains also to mainstream international theories in the West that neither explain nor shape policies in a straightforward kind of manner. So when realism and liberalism offer us competing explanations of the Cold War, this simply highlights that none of them, is actually, satisfactorily capable of representing what is going on there. If realism is complete link between knowledge and power. If you want your theories to be taken up in practice, you might need a paradigm shift a la Kuhn, or you might need an epistemic shift a la Foucault, or the kinds of things that Peter was talking about earlier. But those kinds of things, paradigm shifts, epistemic shifts, they're not actually open to purposeful manipulation. So that leaves Chinese international theory and Western international theory with the challenge to bridge the gap between theory and practice. So I want to just end my comments by suggesting how one might face those two challenges. And suggest that a more indirect approach, if the instrumental we do a theory that is supposed to challenge X, Y, or Z, isn't, working, and we know that it isn't working, then one might need to take a little bit more of a circumspect approach to this project. So one thing that I think might be useful would be a systematic historical analysis of the relationship between Chinese thought and practice, because this turns the abstract notions of morality, relationality, symbiosis into concrete Chinese practices, and therefore, makes clear how they actually differ or potentially differ from those found in other cultures. It also, by covering the entirety of Chinese history, it integrates internal and external diversity and historical ups and downs. And this means that it writes some kind of encompassing and dynamic conception of what is Chinese into the history of the world without preaching to other people of what they ought to do. The second point that I would suggest might be useful is the analysis of the epistemic level of knowledge production and change, because the epistemic level basically links the grammar of knowledge to historical shifts. It is the level at which we're faltering when we're trying to directly translate our theories into practice, right? And this would allow us to explore whether or not Chinese and Western thought, for example, today, are based on different epistemes or not. Are they based on the same episteme? What does that have to say about the possibilities of one overtaking the other and so, or challenging the other and so on? Or are we actually confronted with different epistemes, and what does that mean? In addition, this makes the unconscious working of epistemes conscious. And it therefore brings out the idiosyncrasies and limitations of those kinds of grammars of knowledge production in particular periods. And by doing so, I think it bridges the gap between theory and practice in a bit of a roundabout way. And so I would suggest in conclusion that both of these strategies could also work as a highly attractive model for others to take up as a kind of intellectual, humane leadership of Chinese international theory. Thank you.
Thank you, Beate. I share with you a lot of your puzzles about the Chinese school, in particular, the relevance of ancient Chinese wisdom to the modern Chinese thought or practice. Another puzzle I have had is about relational theory. How could as constructivist incarnation theorists think about a lasting Chinese wisdom, short of any social construction or short of any evolution of its time? I mean, Professor Qin's relationality is he viewed a kind of lasting Chinese wisdom. So I'm also puzzled about that. But you seem to have suggested the dilemma to Chinese theorists. On the one hand, they should pursue a kind of distinct Chinese IR theory, but at the risk of sinocentrism. On the other hand, they should pay attention to sinocentrism at the cost of distinct Chinese IR theory. So probably Marxism is a good example for us to understand this dilemma of Chinese IR theorists. So Justin, please. So you are the only Marxist scholar for us. And we are quite interested to know how you, in your Marxist viewpoint, how the 3 branches or 4 branches of Chinese school, which is emerged in a society dominated by communism, what is the similarity or difference between, or is there any relevance between the Chinese school and the Marxism? Please, Justin.
Thank you, Lu Peng, and thank you for organizing this great event. Like Beate and others, I'm very much a beginner in this field, but you sent us fantastic materials to read. The quality is very high, and I hope my comments are not too basic and too obvious to be of use to the discussion. So reading these materials that you sent me reminded me of just how paradoxical international theory is as a field of study. So on the one hand, it's always produced in particular national contexts. But on the other hand, to really succeed, it has to transcend those contexts. It sounds impossible. And yet, of course, Hans Morgenthau built this transcending into his definition of political realism. Political realism, he wrote, refuses to identify the moral aspirations of a particular nation with the moral laws that govern the universe. I think it's a great sentence. And I think of this sentence as the Morgenthau test. And when Stanley Hoffman called post-war international relations an American social science, he didn't mean it as a compliment, of course. He meant that American IR was failing this Morgenthau test. It was functioning more as a national ideology than as a disinterested field of analysis. So what about the Chinese school? And I'm assuming for the purpose of this discussion that it does exist, because I think enough people believe that it does. And in fact, I think that people are right to say that a Chinese school of international theory is inevitable. But for me, the real question is, can the Chinese school avoid becoming a national ideology that identifies China with the moral law of the universe? Perhaps not. But I think there is a way for it to be not only that. And this is by exploring those critical approaches that were mentioned by Beate that were left out when China imported mainstream IR in the 1990s. These approaches include feminism, post-structuralism, post-colonialism, but they also include an approach which at first sight would seem to have no hope at all in this discussion. And of course, I mean Marxism. Now, of course, I don't mean Leninism or Maoism, which in my view are better regarded as political ideologies. I mean Marx's analytical method of historical materialism. And I know this is a hopeless suggestion because as long as Marxism remains the state ideology of China, finding a non-Marxist language is actually a necessary precondition for intellectual development. But here's the thing. If we look at where the Chinese school has gone to find this other language, namely classical Chinese thought, we find that this raises two problems of its own. First, it leads us back through cultural particularism to the danger of national ideology. And second, using a classical language also means capitalism. Now, of course, Marxism has catastrophic failings of its own, especially when it becomes a state ideology. But I think that used as a critical social theory, it makes three contributions which could help counterbalance what many people see as this sinocentrism of the Chinese school. And these contributions are a relational view of reality, which is not ethnocentric, a method of ideology critique, which includes self-critique, and a historical narrative that addresses China's whole modern.
So if you don't mind, we may wait Justin for several minutes. No audio. So Justin is not here. So probably we should move to the next speaker. So, oh, Justin, you have come back. Okay.
I got cut off.
Please continue.
Thank you. So I was saying that, that the Chinese school wants to reject cultural essentialism, but Jin Ya-Qing also says that relationality is the foundational concept for Chinese society, while Western society is based on what he calls individualistic rationality. Now, I think there's obviously some kind of truth to this. These are not the same kinds of society, but at the level of social theory, I think it's a very misleading contrast that could not be sustained if Marxism was in the picture. And I say that because, of course, Karl Marx, a Westerner, arguably produced the most systematic critique of individualistic rationality that we have. His materialist conception of history is fundamentally relational because it's based on what he called the double relationship, the way that humans simultaneously relate to each other and to non-human nature. In fact, the climax of Marxist thought was an anti-substantialist critique of fetishism, in which he showed how, in his words, capital is not a thing, but a social relation between persons. So my point here is not that Chinese thought lacks the resources to conceptualize relationality. It is that these resources are not unique to China, and counterposing them to a monolithic conception of the West can be very problematic because it suppresses the radical self-critical tradition in Western thought and thereby implies that China is uniquely aligned with what Morgenthau called the moral law of the universe. And this, of course, is why I think we need the second.
Lupan. Hey, Lupan.
Hey.
Before we get the speaker back, can I say something here to this group?
Yes.
Mentality about the foreign policy, and also Beate concerned there's a political goal of the Chinese IR theorists, Well, actually, I should say that's true. And I think all of the Chinese theorists want to shape people's mentality and also want to have impact on China's policymaking. But the result is different. First, I don't think the Chinese government accept any idea and from these Chinese IR theories. And second, I will tell you a very funny issue. And if you read Biden's inauguration speech, you find that his speech is very consistent with the moral realist IR theory. And he even said that to leading the world by example. So I think these actually moral realism to not only have the power and to shape Chinese ideas, very possibly shape foreign policymakers. And the main reason is that, and I think these some of the theories and at least the moral realism is actually is based on the assumption of not only Chinese phenomenon or the ancient Chinese history, but also based on the modern international relations after the World War II. Thank you. And also, if I can add something about that, about Chinese IR theory, many people assume Chinese IR theory possibly will become a Sinocentric theory, like a American theory. Well, I doubt. I don't know whether they have the motivation behind the theories, but it's a very, very impossible. I think a rational theory in some way regard the Chinese culture is relational, but the Western culture is individual. But actually, the individual culture in the Western society only appeared after modernization. Before the modernization, the Western culture is also relational.
Okay, since Justin has come back, please continue, Justin.
Thank you. I'm really sorry I got cut off. So I was talking about what Marx might say about the idea of all under heaven. And I was saying that he might say, first of all, that it looks like an ideological worldview that naturalizes hierarchy and legitimates a dominant role for China. And secondly, I think he would say that this is not so distinctive to China. Again, all pre-capitalist societies produced ethnocentric cosmologies that organized nature, humanity, and supernature into a hierarchy. Europe's version was called the Great Chain of Being. And just like the Chinese version, it legitimated the feudal inequalities of the time and represented the ruling groups as the mediating link between heaven and earth, not the son of heaven, but the divine right of kings. It was the same principle. So my question here really is once again about the Morgenthau test. Marx began by criticizing his own national context in a book that was literally called The German Ideology. So my question is, would there be room in the Chinese school for a book called The Chinese Ideology? And what would it say? So this brings me to the third contribution from Marxism, namely a framework for understanding modern Chinese history. And what I mean by this here is not just the rise of China today, but also the century of humiliations and the enormous upheaval of the communist revolution. I think that this longer story tells us important things about what drives and shapes the international system as a whole. And yet, from the little that I have read so far, it seems to me that the Chinese school is much more focused on trying to provide an indigenous worldview to go with the rise of China than on explaining this much larger, longer, wider picture. But surely it needs to be explained, I mean, in international theory, if nowhere else. And I think that historical materialism can help with this as well. I think it comes in two parts. The first part would be Marx's analysis of capitalism. And this identifies the social logic that would, in Marx's words, batter down all Chinese walls. And in a sense, this has now happened. China is now finally part of the capitalist world economy. But that does not explain the paradox that Chinese capitalism is ruled by a communist state. For this, we need the second part, which is Leon Trotsky's idea of uneven and combined development. Now, Trotsky's idea was that the human world is both multiple and interactive, and this continually interrupts and subverts unilinear logics of process. This, of course, has strong parallels with Professor Ren Zhao's Gongsheng theory, but it also differs because it does not privilege any one cultural region. I think it was Robert Gilpin in 1981 who was the first to see the potential of this idea for Western international theory, although it has also been used more recently by Barry Buzan and others. And I think it helps us to integrate these different parts of the modern history of China. So how does it do that? Well, Trotsky applied his theory to modern international relations like this. He said, if we look at the history of capitalist society, we see that it didn't emerge everywhere simultaneously. It started first in one or two countries and then took hold in other places at other times. This international unevenness transformed the external conditions for those later developers. It produced a whip of external necessity that forced them to change whatever their existing stage of development if they wanted to survive. But it also created what he called a privilege of historic backwardness, because late developers could import ideas, technology, and investment directly from earlier developers without having to reinvent them for themselves. And in this way, he argued that modern capitalist elements from outside were being grafted onto pre-existing societies, creating hybrid social formations. And the new political dynamics of this combined development also changed the shape of the international system as a whole. And here, of course, for Trotsky, the key example was the Bolshevik Revolution that produced the Cold War, which dominated world politics for much of the 20th century. Now, of course, Trotsky himself tried to use this theory as a closed system to prove that socialist revolution was inevitable after all. But actually, I think when you think about it, its implications are much more open than that. You really can't say what is going to happen next in this flux of multiple temporalities and international combinations. But what you can do is to use this theory to make sense of the historical present. And nothing, I think, illustrates this better than the modern history of China. When Europe industrialized in the 19th century, Imperial China, unlike Japan, was unable to respond to the whip of external necessity. As a result, China suffered the century of humiliations, leading eventually to the destruction of the imperial state and the anti-capitalist Maoist takeover in 1949. Chinese communism then imported a Stalinist command economy and combined it with collectivized peasant agriculture to produce a completely unique social formation of Maoism. This restored China's unity and independence, but by the 1970s, capitalist growth in Japan and the East Asian late developers had left China behind. And so the Communist Party itself began to import capitalist technology and investment and reforms. And this time, China was able to use the privilege of historic backwardness to engineer a spectacular industrial revolution. And the result of this is two things. On the one hand, a new hybrid, a one-party communist state with an increasingly capitalist economy, and on the other hand, the geopolitical upheaval that we call the rise of China. Now, to me, in conclusion, this is a story of how Chinese society has been transformed and retransformed through its interactions and combinations with other societies, and how this process eventually produced a developmental formula that is now transforming the wider world. I think that the theory that we need to understand this process cannot be one that is unique to any particular culture. And that's because the process lies beyond all of them in the interaction of the cultures themselves. This tells me that the Morgenthau test is not only a normative challenge, but also an analytical one for all of us. It's a test that Marxism has often failed, but after 70 years of communist rule, Marxism itself is now part of China's intellectual heritage. And if we take it as a critical social theory, it does seem to possess significant resources for relational theory, ideology critique, and non-linear historical reasoning. Just possibly, I think these resources could help the Chinese school to overcome the single biggest challenge, or the single.
Okay.
Biggest challenge.
So have you finished, Justin?
Yes, I finished. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So this is a very splendid explanation of the understanding of Chinese school from a Marxist position. I just want to remind you one thing, that though the classical Marxism discourse has disappeared from Chinese school discourse, the modern Marxism, such as Cox's discourse, are still very popular in Chinese school discourse. Think about how Professor Qin has proved the necessity of a Chinese school. He quoted Cox that the theory is always by someone for some purpose. Because we have limited time, we leave these things to the free discussion section. So our next speaker is Milja Kurki, who is my teacher at Exeter 16 years ago. So Milja, nice to meet you. Okay, please. Hello, please.
Hi everybody. Can you hear me okay? Good. I must admit I have been dropping off, and I must say, Justin, when you just finished your last sentence there, it tantalizingly finished on, and the real challenge for the Chinese school is, and then it cut off. So I don't actually know what your real challenge to the Chinese school is, but hopefully you can maybe illuminate it. So apologies, I'm coming to you from mid Wales, and the internet is a little bit on and off here. So I hope I can get through my quick remarks here before I disappear somewhere into the internet ether. I don't have very systematic comments to offer today. I'll just offer a few very brief remarks, and that's partly because I was new to the project. I came to it quite late, so I'm still kind of really catching up with the reading and so on, but also because I think my thoughts are confused and getting increasingly confused in terms of what I actually think and what I might have to contribute to this project. What I thought I'd do is just ignore my written comments and just make a couple of comments around kind of questions that arise for me from the discussion so far, and also from the various fantastic texts that we were sent, and also other texts that I've been reading. And those are really comments around questions around what kind of a project is the Chinese school. The first question that we were given asked, is Chinese school a national or a cultural or a scientific enterprise? And I think a lot of my thoughts revolve around those, the ambiguity of the ors in between the national, the cultural, some of these thoughts also that I've been thinking about for some years, around questions of kind of how do we come to issues around science? How do we come to international relations and its relationship to science? My starting point for this, I suppose, is quite simply that science itself is a cultural enterprise. It is embedded in particular and general cultural kind of contexts and legacies and conceptualizations and so on. And the reason I'm concerned about these questions these days is in part because, like Peter, I do think that the questions around relational thinking, the questions around quantum mechanics, the questions around what sciences, natural sciences are telling us about, not just about natural sciences, but also the relationship between social and natural sciences, are really, really important questions for the discipline of international relations. And that's partly because, as Peter so well puts it, international relations concepts, a lot of the classical categories of Western Anglo-American international relations are also tied up with very particular narratives of science, very particular Newtonian imaginations of the universe, very particular assumptions about things and things moving in backgrounds, things interacting, and so on. So I think it's really important to open those questions up. And this is where my interest in the Chinese school actually comes in, because I'm interested in these questions partly because some of the most interesting and important relational thought is written from the Chinese school, however you think about it. I'm not sure if the Chinese school is a nationalist or national enterprise, but certainly there is something to a phrasing that I think Karin Fierke has officially even put down on paper, that when it comes to relational thinking, there's something of a home for relational thinking in Chinese and also Indian and other Asian scholarship. And so the question for me, in a sense, is, what can and how can the conversation around science and the reimagination of the nature of science, the scientific enterprise, if you like, what can it benefit from, and how can the Chinese school and Chinese school thinkers, in a sense, help rewrite the narrative around science in international relations? I suppose that's how I would phrase the question. And I raise this partly because there is such interesting work exactly around this question. Here, many people work on these questions, but I'm thinking also of people such as Karin Fierke, Emilian Kowalski, and others also, who are really interested in this question of, let me put it this way, in order to understand the meaning and implications of something like quantum mechanics for social sciences, but also for the natural sciences, what kind of cultural traditions, what kind of cultural imaginations and conceptual systems can we draw on to make sense of that? Karin Fierke's project for some years now has been to essentially to say to us, to tell us that if we look to certain Taoist and certain Buddhist philosophies, not as pure traditions that give us the necessary kind of truths about the world, but as ways of conceptually making sense of some of the implications of quantum mechanics, we can actually, in a sense, reinterpret the nature of science. This has really important implications for international relations, our understandings of war, our understandings of strategy, and so on, in her view. And for me, those kinds of questions are really fundamental in this dialogue between the so-called Chinese school and whatever you might call Western IR. What's really exciting about that dialogue also is that I think at the moment how it is also followed up, it's followed up in a kind of hybrid kind of sense. So if one thinks of Karin's work, for example, or Emilian Kowalski's, for example, the analysis of these questions is kind of eclectic, if you see what I mean. We can jump between different traditions and different theorists without necessarily holding on to kind of pure traditions, either in the Western conceptions of Weber, for example, or in our conceptions of religious traditions or philosophies, Asian philosophies, and so on. So that for me is an interesting aspect of the debate. I don't have any answers to it, but I suppose if I was to phrase it in form of a question, I'm interested in hearing more about and thinking more through those questions of what can this dialogue between Chinese scholarship and IR theorists from other parts of the world, what can it do to kind of elucidate that really crucial question for the field around how we rethink science, and as such also how we rethink international relations. Around this and out of this arise all kinds of difficult questions, and these are difficult questions, I think, as others have also emphasized, for all kinds of international relations scholars, all kinds of social scientists these days, because they also raise this really important set of questions about what the purpose of knowledge construction is. I think there is a quite an important, has been for many, many decades, centuries even, a very important set of criticisms being made about the dangers of hegemonic knowledge, dangers of trying to imagine international relations as something that tries to capture the nature of the world, relations in it, and to generate knowledge that somehow has a universal as well as universally applicable somehow meaning. I think as we think about these relations between the Chinese school and IR theories in general, I think it's important to think on kind of what the purpose, what the nature of the knowledge is that we are to produce out of this, either the conversation between these perspectives or within the perspectives themselves. And in this regard, the debates around decolonization of international relations, the debates around what exactly global IR means and might mean for these conversations are important, as are, I think, questions around something I think that Beate alluded to too, which is these questions of how do we do international relations, how do we generate knowledge about international relations without generating knowledge in the traditional ways of thinking, traditional ways of writing? What kind of other alternative kinds of knowledge practices are there? And I raise this partly because of these criticisms, not just within IR, but also within the natural sciences, around questions of science not being an abstract exercise of trying to understand the world out there by observing it with our eyes and writing theories about it, but rather that sciences themselves are an experiential, spiritual even, exercise of probing the world. And so if we actually start to think about those kinds of challenges of how we think about science, the questions also around what kind of knowledge, what kind of engagement with the world do we have? What kind of conversations as a result do we have with each other also arise out of this dialogue? As you can tell, my thoughts are confused and all over the place, but I think the conversations around these things are really important. I was very impressed and taken by a comment in Professor Ren's article around the challenges, the problems of the porousness of the liberal order. I would add to that the problems of the deep kind of troubles of the conceptual systems that we have to try to capture and manage the relationalities on the planet at the moment. And in that conversation, I think Chinese school, however you imagine it, and I don't imagine it as a national enterprise, I imagine it as a kind of multifaceted set of interventions into thinking and doing IR differently. In that context, I think the Chinese school has a really important role to play as we try to figure out some of these questions and also try to avoid some of the deep challenges that are coming our way. But I shall leave my comments there. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Milja. And since we have limited time, I will move the conference to the next speaker. Professor Ayşe Zarakol, please.
Thank you. Can everyone hear me? Yes. Okay. Thank you. Like Milja Kurki, I'm a latecomer to the project, so I'm also getting my bearings. But I'm very happy to be included for two reasons. First, if I can be allowed a moment of self-promotion, but it's relevant, I promise. I just finished a book, which is forthcoming soon, called Before the West, Rise and Fall of Eastern World Orders, in which I advance an alternative Asian history for IR theorizing. And as a part of that, in process of writing that book, I had to learn a lot of Asian history, including Chinese history of a certain period. And that makes me want to engage much more with, you know, Chinese IR theory and look at how Chinese IR theory is using Chinese history. But it also makes me, I feel, better equipped to assess in my own way, you know, some of the claims therein, because I think there is a, you know, there is a danger in IR, which we're familiar with from, you know, Western IR theory of encountering history only through theory. So if you do, you know, regular IR theory and you learn about 19th century European politics through realism, or, you know, the Greek city-state system only through IR theory, you always find that history verifies whatever whatever the theory claims, right? So it's a bit hard to assess, you know, that relationship. And it's especially so, I think, you know, there's a difference, and I say this as someone from who grew up in Turkey, there's a difference, you know, when it's somebody from there saying, you know, this concept means this in our language. You know, if I say, you know, namus, it means this in Turkish, it would be very difficult, I think, for outsiders to challenge that interpretation. So I mentioned this because there is some of this difficulty, I think, going on in this conversation that we're trying to build. You know, these gaps that we have mutually in terms of our knowledge of history, concepts, interpretations, historiographical debates among historians. And I'll come back to that. And I think that's a difficult bridge to build and cross, as some of the other speakers have also discussed. The second reason why I'm very happy to be included in this project is because I've been included as a Westerner. and I found this very amusing because in most IR contexts, I'm included as a non-Westerner. So this is, I think, the very first time I have been labeled a representative of the West, and I'm going to save the correspondence for any occasion where my identity is questioned, that this is the official verdict. But exactly this point is what I want to discuss in my brief time. What does it mean to label something Western Chinese and whatnot? And there's a danger. I mean, I'm going close to the last of the list. Some of the points I want to make have been made already, but maybe I'll make them in a slightly different way. And I know it's getting late in China, so we'll try to be brief. So, you know, this question of what do we mean when we say X school of thought or X school of IR? In my thinking, that could denote like one of three things, right? So one is, you know, when we say something belongs to X place, it's a kind of a descriptive shorthand, which captures a more complex, complicated package of, you know, epistemological, ontological, or methodological, or maybe all of those dispositions choices. So when we talk about, you know, the Copenhagen school or the Cambridge school, you know, the place name is actually standing in for kind of an approach, and it's not so important that, you know, these things happened in Copenhagen, or it could have been somewhere else, right? It's not exactly an accident, because certain, you know, kind of thinking, I think, attracts similar kind of thinking. So it's not exactly accidental, but it's not exactly by design. It's kind of historically contingent that these people came together at the same time, and then they can leave that place, go to other locations like Barry did, right? And still can be kind of, you know, members of that school, honorary or not. Or for instance, you know, Pocock in Cambridge School, he was from New Zealand, you know, so it's actually, you know, that referent in that context is kind of a shorthand. And I think when we use it that way, it's generally, you know, a good thing to be associated with such a school, because it makes it, you know, it kind of amplifies that like-minded kind of family of thinking. And maybe allows it to reach, you know, a wider audience than it would have otherwise if it was just one person kind of writing in that way. I mean, the downside is maybe it makes you a target of attack later because you're kind of associated with that school. But in general, I think it's a good thing. Then the opposite of that is, when we say X school, it could be, a description of a bias, right? That would otherwise go unnoticed because the position is masquerading as universal. So I think when we say, for instance, American IR, I actually think that's what I think we mean it more in this way, that we are kind of unearthing or uncovering an Americanness to a certain kind of IR that claims to be universal and universally applicable. And I think it was Justin, referred to Hoffman's IR, American Social Science. Many people read that article as kind of complimentary, but I think actually it's a critical article, as Justin also said. So it's actually American. When I say American IR, or when others say IR is American, we mean it's kind of trapped in a certain kind of bias that it's not aware of. There's too much focus on individuals as a starting point of analysis, kind of a preoccupation with measuring things, a fixation on problem solving, the certain American habitus that kind of underlies much of theorizing, and not just in IR. This has been documented in many social sciences, by historians of social science that emanate outside of the US. And of course, it doesn't capture all, sorts of approaches actually emerging out of the US, but I think this is what we mean when we say American IR. And then I think, and in that case, I think it's kind of a bad thing to call something a school of X, or like use the national label in describing it, because we're saying you're actually less than what you claim to be, or not as universal as you claim to be. Now, in between, I think, is potentially a third position, which may be kind of like a standpoint argument, right? Similar to what people say, like when they say feminist IR, right? It's kind of a claim that you can occupy a particular standpoint that is located in time and place, but not in a biased way, but in a way that illuminates, brings into view things that would otherwise be unnoticed, that things you wouldn't be able to see from another vantage point. And I think the global IR project, to the extent that it embraces Chinese IR, different kinds of IR, has this type of ambition, right? Bringing in standpoints in IR theorizing that have until now been ignored in favor of the Western or the US or the European standpoint. And I think that's something that's analytically and normatively more defensible. Of course, I mean, as a branding project or as a strategic political professional project, the label Chinese IR serves all sorts of purposes that also have come up in the discussion until now. But if we're talking about kind of how is this potentially analytically defensible, it has to be something like standpoint, standpoint IR. The danger there, of course, and others have pointed to this as well, it's very easy for standpoint stuff to collapse into a particular essentializing narrative and to be hijacked by various political projects. And I think especially in treatment of history, there's a danger of really flattening it. I mean, as it happened to our understanding of European history. And of course, there's so much Chinese history to incorporate into the IR narrative. It's very easy to just look into that, many years and always see things that you want to see that serve, the point that needs to be made right now. And that's a great danger. that's not, and it's not very easy to avoid. Of course, I mean, one could say, like, what difference does it make? Because, Europeans or Westerners have done this for many, many years. Why can't China have its own, flattened schematic history in service of theory? And I mean, I would have, 3 answers to why China or Chinese IR shouldn't do that. One, I think, we talk about American IR or Western IR in the second sense that I mentioned, but it was always a project that had a universal claim and ambition. So it didn't start by saying, well, at least in the IR version, right? It was claiming not a positionality, even though it did have it, which made it somewhat more palatable. So if you come out of the gate saying, I'm Chinese IR, and claim that position, and then also have that schematic history, it's just not going to have the same kind of reception that the other side had. I mean, just strategically thinking. I mean, even if you wanted to do it, you were okay with doing that. It's just not going to go over as well, even as well as the Western version. And I think because of all the debates we've had about Eurocentrism and where we are in the discipline, people are more primed to reject these types of projects, because we've been having these debates for some time now about Eurocentrism. And even though, I mean, people are in the name of pluralism a little bit more open to Chinese IR, Buddhist IR, these labeled IRs. But I think overall, like, comparatively speaking to how people were, some decades ago, in general, people are much more aware of these debates about, positionality and so on. So I don't think, there's also that it's not a new kind of project. It's coming in the heels of the Eurocentrism debate. And finally, I mean, there's a substantive reason why this should not be the route to go down on, because I think there is another way. I mean, I think there's, that standpoint, China bringing something new to the table. Actually, that is a difficult position to occupy, but it's not impossible if one tries. And here I think I fall somewhere between Barry and Justin, where Barry said there's something especially unique about China, and then Justin said, not really. And it's not that, I mean, I kind of agree with both of you, but at the same time, I want to occupy the middle ground. I grew up in Turkey, as I said. I've lived all over the place. Every place I've been to has a uniqueness claim. And so I'm very suspicious of any about China. I still would maintain that it's not as unique as it is claimed to be. For instance, I would say, out of my book project, I would say, like, the fact that China was conquered for a very, very long time, twice, by inner Asian dynasties is like an experience that ties China to the rest of Asia and the various institutions there, because that's an experience that's shared, right? The colonialism experience, there are many shared experiences that, of course, everything is experienced in a unique way in its own locality. But when you want to see connections and ties and institutions that travel, you can find them in Chinese history also. And those bridges could be made if we are careful. And that way, Chinese IR, drawing more from those connections, could also speak, I mean, not fully universal, because we know that's kind of maybe a fool's errand, but could speak to rest of Asia, for instance. Why not? We don't have to go all the way, and we don't have to just be very, very unique. There could be kind of a middle point of appeal for Chinese IR theory. So that's all I have to say. Thank you for including me.
Thank you, Zarakol. Thank you for a very excellent talk. I have to say that the reason we invited you is because your two books, one entitled After Defeat, the other is on the hierarchical international system, really impressed us. And the more important thing is I always have the difficulty to identify the nationality of someone through the name. So, but the fact is that your talk has proved that we have made the right strategy. Our next speaker is Stefano Guzzini, please.
Thank you very much, and thank you for having me with you. I'm aware of the fact that we are now almost 3 hours into it, and so we can tell our students that we can be longer having an uninterrupted discussion than they would allow us in a seminar room. I must admit I was a little bit intrigued at the very beginning when I got the invitation, because I didn't exactly know how to react. After all, the invitation is out for dialogue, but the questions are questions which are almost as if the Chinese theorists would go to an exam. Please tell us whether or not we passed the exam. And of course, that is an impossible position to be in, right? I mean, there's no way that a person would take that subject position. And so it's almost like, I understand, having read now several times about the gift, that there might be some reciprocity here, so that one should not abuse of this invitation in actually taking it seriously of being in an exam, which I will surely not do. So my talk will be about 3 things. One is about theory, one is about the Chinese, and one is about what I can do with the many things that I have read and how I can relate to them for my work, but maybe also in return for the work over there. And I start with theory because there is, I have noticed in the writings, a similar difficulty in China to distinguish several levels of which we do theorizing, which are particular to international relations compared to at least some social sciences when I speak of the Western tradition in which they developed. So for instance, sometimes we use theory in IR as meaning just foreign policy doctrine, i.e. it is the kind of systematization of how to do foreign policy. Raymond Aron has been very critical about this particular way of going about it, but it's a very, very common way. And I'm working at the research institute, which is under the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and the Ministry of Defense in Denmark. And that's very often what they think theory is all about. Theory is giving them the grand strategy. And it comes then with the kind of confusion that we have very often in the West, but not only there, of confusing realist foreign policy strategy with realist observational theory. So when things go bad, well, realism as a theory must be right. Or when people go violent, well, then realism is correct. And if people cooperate, then, well, maybe the liberals are right. But that has nothing to do with the one with each other. Realists will have to understand war, and the liberals will have to understand, no, realists will have to understand cooperation, and liberals will have to understand war. But there are different reasons for it. And so this conflation is very peculiar to IR, because IR developed as practical knowledge first, and which then only made up a discipline, whereas sociology or economics derived out of the social stratification, social differentiation within societies for which we needed special knowledge for special new fields. IR, or the international or the external field, was already given in that particular. And so rather than finding new knowledge for the new field, we had old knowledge that needed to invent a new field. And IR has always had this kind of practical component attached to it, which makes it that many of us are drawn back into expectations that what we do when we do theory is a foreign policy strategy. And if I understand correctly, that's also the expectation of the Chinese government. It is not the only government who ever came up with that particular expectation. The second is, and that is what the English school for me is a kind of self-observation by international society. When I was at the LSE, Michael Banks, an American teacher at the time in theory, when I mentioned the English school, he said, well, the British school of imperialism. So the first answer was, it is the ex post facto justification and rereading of a particular English, the Pax Britannica, put into a theoretical language. So it's a language which is perfectly understandable by the practitioner, because it is de facto a language which comes out of practice, but by the self-observation of practice. That still means, though, that you're very close to, you would be Chatham House, so to speak, but you're very close to the field. You're not doing the foreign policy strategy only, but you think about in terms of what this might possibly mean. And this is honestly a vast majority of things which are going on under the label of IR theory. And the English school is special in that regard because it is this systematization of a certain historical moment, of a certain, I mean, why 5 institutions? Ask if Bull were around, why would he have only 5 institutions? The answer is, well, these are the ones that I found in reality. They are around. These are the ones we have been living with. These make up the order. There's no deduction system, nothing which goes beyond it. It is a systematization of what we have around. And then, of course, we have what we usually call theory in the social sciences, namely an observational theory, in which all of this is the zoo. We are watching the animals. We are watching from the outside. And there are 2 ways of doing so. The one is a relatively instrumental one, in which we try to find explanations and predictions in which you can lock in things into easy if-thens or things that can be applied. And then there is the constitutive functional theories, the lenses that we have that divide the world, that tell us what is significant in this flow and stream of events out there. What is effect, which coming from the Latin means actually something made of. Facere means making. So it's something that we by our lenses make. And if I understand you correctly, we are all over the place into this in the West, and you happily return the favor. There's just as much confusion or interaction within the 4 levels, so to speak. It's the foreign policy doctrine, the self-description, the instrumental, and the constitutive observational theory that we have here. But that produces a couple of difficulties, because we could see in the discussion, when some of your scholars present what they want to do, of course it is connected to thinking international order and thinking foreign policy, in particular Chinese foreign policy, in the upcoming international order. And that makes perfect sense, but it can have different levels. And Justin wanted you to be more self-critical, which is basically getting the observational distance to what is going on. And it is an invitation of perhaps making sure that this distancing is done. Because otherwise, of course, the risk of essentializations, of not speaking truth to power, as one said before, but and so on, is much, much, much bigger. And it is a difficult thing to say if one is coming from a big power, because then, of course, the order and foreign policy is so closely connected to what one country does, as it was for the Brits and the Americans. But I come from I come from 2 who tried to be big powers, Italians and Germans. They utterly failed, luckily for the world order, by the way. And for me, this is not necessarily the right thing to go. And so therefore, my invitation would be, just as it is to all my Western colleagues as well, it doesn't make any difference there, is to make more of a difference, because I could see in this context, in this Chinese discussion context, 2 risks. The one is, what I just said, is to see IR as a gigantic single case study writ large when it meets the rest of the world, which is what the Brits, the Americans, and now perhaps the Chinese seem to be doing. If you're doing that, for the ones who come from the periphery, where I would put myself, there is not much interest. We have been there, then you would just exchange the label for something which has been doing or going on beforehand. I would have to learn it just as much as I did have to learn the British and the American. That's the fate of the periphery. I will have to learn whatever that means, but it is not necessarily an engagement which I would find a good one for world order, but also for international theory on the one other hand. And the other one, which I find actually quite remarkable, is the unbelievable statism of what we have been so far discussing. It's taken for granted that the most important things is how states and foreign policies do with each other. I was hoping for Justin. I mean, capitalism, does that not appear? Is there no market system which is an independent, autonomous logic which is ruling or intervening in this order? When I read the studies, they look indeed quite similar to the English school, much more than to the American, who have integrated IPE far, far more. Because the political economy is the big absent, or was for a long time the big absent in the English school. And I felt that there was a huge need to integrate this. And It makes even someone so suspicious that one would believe that the market is entirely controlled by the state, that there is no autonomous logic, because one cannot imagine an autonomous logic of the market, but there is. And people in the periphery will have no privilege to think that there is no autonomous logic that doesn't hit them every day in and out. And so there was one big absence for me, which I think comes out of this conflation of foreign policy concerns with international theory, which is this very strong statism on which ruled out international political economy, and also to some extent the study of global civil society, which again didn't really appear very much in any of the writings I've seen so far, which are very, very much about how to think the international in the classical interstate order. And I think for IR theory, not for foreign policy necessarily, but for IR theory, it would be good if that were overcome. So let me move to the second part, which is from theory to China. So how Chinese is all of this? And I think I was so happy to hear the points by Xi, if I pronounce it correctly, about the fetishization of difference. I think that's exactly the point. The moment that one starts this game in which one comes into play only because we are different, it becomes an impossible situation, I think. And it has even a slightly colonial component, because, right, good old colonial power would decide either you are like us, then you're redundant because we are better, or you are somewhat to be heard of, but only if you're really, really completely different. If anything in between, you have no right to speak, or we have no need to listen, to put it this way. And I think it's a game, when one gets into that game, it's not a good game. And I'm very happy to hear that it seems that everyone seems on the same side. This is something that is a game that nobody wants to play anymore. So I had the impression. I was not entirely sure, because there is this one reference, which is a tactical reference. We got distributed this article about the post-colonial take on the Chinese school. And it makes a classical Krishna point, which is to say, sure, we essentialize the post-colonial, but we do it for instrumental reasons. It's a kind of way of putting ourselves into the agenda and being visible and so on. It was an early argument when it was in its beginnings. I think it's not necessary. I'm so 100% sure that simply by the size, the importance, and the production of theory in China, you don't have to bother all that much about it. And it reminded me, I was once invited to, as a guest speaker to the Korean Association of International Studies. And I was invited because the title of the conference was, why was there no Korean IR theory? And it was beautiful to see, because you had the elder generation who was pushing for this need of having it, and the young generation basically answering, we have none because we don't care. It is not important for us to have this Korean label attached to it. We want to do good work, whatever that is. And they were aware, of course, of the fact that this meant that there were many things that were imported from somewhere else, sure. But they were not so taken by the necessity anymore, given also the size of the discipline. I mean, to my European friends, I always say, the EISA brings together 800 to 1,000 people. And the Korean Association has 1,600 members. So it is one country which basically has more than the association in Europe and the general association is bringing together. The size will make it. I don't think that there's so much to go for it. That does not mean that theory is unimportant. Theory is extremely important to turn away from the periphery, because you don't want to be the data provider for a software that always somebody else has written. You want to be in control of how to write these softwares yourself. And that makes perfect sense. But these softwares will come at the end of the day, maybe more or maybe less with a kind of Chinese label. And by this, I mean simply something which would be so specific to it. I think there will be differences simply from the backgrounds. As I said, I'm a German Italian. We can go into long discussions about whether the individualism, which is usually portrayed in the Chinese writings about the West, is something I would recognize for being as a German. I'm not so sure about it, for good or for bad. So it's trying to get beyond this kind of essentializations as well. And that means finally, I have a third point in which how I would like to engage. And I really liked again the idea of the translation. So one way of translating is, as she was mentioning it, is basically pushing it up on a level of abstraction on which you can find a common language, which you then redescribe or retranslate backwards or downwards. And I think that's nice. That's really, it's a classical way to think about it. And of course, there are things lost in translation. But I cannot assume a kind of incommensurability from the start. I cannot know we cannot speak to each other. This is something we can only find out. And here you can see also the process ontology that Yan Xuetong is insisting so often is part of, I think, comes back of his dual track diplomacy experiences, where things were having a process in which you disagree, but you talk and talk and talk and finding out whether there are some ways of finding a translation of the things that are happening on both sides. And for this, I would like to have some help. Because of course, the nervousness from the outside, and you can see it also in the writings, is that some of the proposed visions of the international order, which is so much better, so much more peaceful, as Barry has said as well, may perhaps not end up to be. And one of the things I noticed is that there is the sense that we Westerners impose a lot of vision of hierarchy to the, whatever you want to call it, tribute system, as I know some are not so happy with the name of it, the idea of hierarchy, when in fact it isn't a hierarchy because the subaltern consents to it. But just because there is consensus doesn't mean that there is no hierarchy. There is a strong hierarchy, it's just a more consensual one. It's the hegemonic one that you can have either in the zillions of traditions of try to understand these consensual orders. And also the play of the gift. So there is this idea that Chinese governments have been giving more than they received, so to speak, which is an old idea also of hegemonic stability theory. The US has been giving many more public goods than it ever received from the other side. They were all free riders and so on. But it is still one which is completely at the discretion of the one in the center. So how do you translate that into a language in which I don't see an ultimate dependence of the subaltern of the competence, as the Germans call it, the competency of the center to define who has which competence, which is the right gift to do, and which is the right respect to have. Because the subaltern position or the hierarchy seems to be built into the system. It is only so peaceful because nobody dares to go against it. But if that is the message, it's not a nice message that the world wants to hear. So there must be something else that you're looking for. When you say that if you understand it as hierarchy, you get it wrong. So I have one question back. What exactly do I get wrong? Thank you very much.
Thank you, Stefano. You have raised many, many precious suggestions and questions. And in fact, I was similarly far from convinced of the necessity of the Chinese school. So you have bring us back to the very starting point of the Chinese school. And we will leave this question to the free discussion period. So we will invite our last but not least
miracle of Zoom. I have to say, I will make it short since I know we're running over time. I mean, I have a colleague who said there are really three master variables in social science: power, interests, and ideas. Now, I think we have general agreement on what power is. At least we know what parameters we'd have to look at. Interests, I'm really not sure about. Ideas are really different. So if I look at the past, if I look at this conversation has been amazingly abstract. What happened to China in the 19th century? I mean, here you'd had a country or a civilization which was basically at the forefront of technology for 2,000 years or more. And it was sort of overcome by the West. Why did that happen? Only because there were diversities of power. I mean, if you look at the present, I mean, Peter alluded to this already. I mean, we're speaking English. Why is that happening? Why don't I know any other foreign languages? Because the Americans won the Second World War. There's no other reason for it. It's very straightforward. If we look at the future, if you look at what's attracted attention in the United States, it is this sort of Graham Allison theory of, is this a Thucydides moment in which conflict between the United States and China is inevitable? It's purely a realist take on what is happening, purely about power. So my challenge would be, and I'll make this very short. I mean, the question really is, are there ideas in China that are unique that could be applied to international relations theory and then other people would have to pay attention to? Now, I know there are ideas that are unique. Are any of those unique ideas dispositive? Would they really set aside China? If you think about a Chinese school, what are those ideas in Chinese thought which are really different from what have existed in the West? And what difference would they make if we're looking at contemporary problems or problems that we'll have in the future? So that's my challenge to the Chinese school would be, if you're thinking about a Chinese school, are there a unique set of ideas which are found in China, which haven't been found in the West, which mainly have to come from, I think, classical Chinese texts, or maybe Chinese reinterpretation of Western texts like Chinese Marxism? So that's the big question that I have after listening to all of you from really all over the world. So the fact that power prevails, I think we might agree on that, but the way in which power is used really depends on the ideas that people have, and those ideas have really varied at different times in different places. So what my question is, what is unique about China? What is China's unique contribution? And will that contribution prevail if we're thinking about our theory in the future? So let me stop there, and that might leave you with a little bit of time.
Thank you. Thank you, Steve. You have saved a lot of our time. So we will move to the next section and the last section of the free discussion. Most of our Western scholars has raised a lot of questions to Professor Yan, and very little question for Professor Shi. So probably we would invite Professor Yan to make a response first.
Well, thank you, Lu Peng, for giving me this privilege. And also, I appreciate everyone's patience for listening to my last comments. I just have 3 points. And the first point is very, very simple. There's no Chinese school of IR. There's no existence of such a kind of thing. That's imagination. So any discussion based on the assumption there's already Chinese school of IR theory, and for me, and that just waste time. Second, there's no Chinese IR. There's only Chinese IR theories. So just like the last speaker said, what's the uniqueness? And from the other side, from my side, the only uniqueness is that we use the ancient Chinese case to illustrate the arguments. The only difference is the case selection, not the other special things from the current IR theories. Second, communist leaders never accept individual leaders' individual serious theory. So because communist leaders believe their theories, they don't believe any theories can develop any theory better than them except Marxism itself. So that means no matter what kind of IR theories developed by Chinese IR theorists, and these theories can never be Chinese governmental ideology. That's impossible because communist leaders will never allow that happen. And meanwhile, these theoretical studies in China, from my understanding, do not have any substantial impact on policy making, because policy making is based on what? Based on the reality, based on the change of the environment, based on the interest. It's not based on any theory. And the third point, and in China, and if we say any kind of thought have an impact on modern AI studies, it is not Marxism. Marxism possibly have the least impact on IR studies in China, because most, even the Chinese government never said that, never claimed the foreign policy should be guided by Marxism. And so from my understanding, the realism, liberalism, constructivism have a very strong impact on IR studies in China, but not Marxism. There's many people studied Marxism, and because the government assigned the job to teaching Marxism, but unfortunately, Marxism has a very little impact on IR studies in China. So that's it.
Thank you, Professor Yan. And Professor Shi, I would like to hear your speak about, if possible, to speak about the difference between your relational theory and that between Professor Qin, because Professor Qin is not here today. So probably you would like to speak something for him and for the difference between your relational theory and that between his. Thank you.
Well, I guess I'm not really prepared to speak on behalf of Yaqing, although I know that he has become more and more concerned about his theorization being criticized as binary drawing or a dichotomous kind of sort of a fixed boundaries between East and West, and I think he's trying to move beyond that. That's so far as I know his recent development. I think he's trying to establish Chinese school as a name, so he has to make distinctions, but that doesn't mean that he cannot cross the gap. So I remain hopeful that he will be able to do that. I would think that, well, whether or not this name of Chinese school is useful really depends on how we think about it. I think the name of Chinese school can be inspirational in many different ways. For example, like Professor Yan Xuetong, I think if not because of his such strong resistance against the name, his research would be very different today. So even for him, the name of Chinese school can be inspiring, although in a different way. For other people, they look into Chinese cultural history and or political history to look for morale or to look for ways of thinking that can make sense of the world better than what they were taught to see, either by their parents or teachers in their own societies or by their foreign teachers when they go to study abroad. They're looking for ways to look at the world differently. I guess this is the ethos of the age. Everybody trying to be, trying to find ways to represent herself differently. So she has a voice. I think that's fine. I mean, the article that Professor Yan forwarded to us, the Yijie Huang's paper on Chinese school and history of Chinese school, he actually is quite enthusiastic about Chinese school. He's not talking about conspiracy. He's actually trying to promote a kind of strategic essentialism, believing that's a way to move beyond this colonial knowledge production. And I myself, actually, he's my student. He was my former students. I actually just published a paper on strategic de-essentialism, going against his way. I'm actually arguing that strategic essentialism eventually exacerbate dichotomy and force people into their own corner. We probably need some kind of a strategic de-essentialism, pretending that we're not essential. I don't know whether I'm essential. I'm an essential being different from other people. This is ontological. I don't know ontology, but I know strategically I can imagine myself being not essential because I have been reconstituted by imperialism and colonialism, and I myself also reconstitute whoever out there trying to influence me. So I try to consider myself being related to those people who seems to control my way of thinking, as my invitation to them to rethink about themselves. So this is this kind of strategic de-essentialism. But then you have to talk. If you have to talk, then you have to talk from a position. And this position, you can name it Chinese, or you can name it scientific, you can name it Marxist, you can name it any way. It's just allow us to bring in perspective that can make up the blind spot, other perspective created for other people not to see. I mean, so I think whether or not we need a Chinese school, it's a choice. It's not a morally bad or morally good. It's a choice, a strategic choice, and there is moral implications, of course. But then the strategic choice allow us to practice our relationship with the world. I mean, this is something that we have to be held accountable. That's my take of the name of Chinese School of IR. I'm not against it. I thank people who include me as part of Chinese school. I feel they're very generous. I feel no harm at all if they tell me that you're not. I mean, this is, everyone has a different way to deal with it.
If our Western series have any questions regarding the Chinese school, you may raise these questions to either Professor Chen or Professor Shi. Unfortunately, Professor Zhang Xiao is not here, so no one will speak on behalf of symbiosis theory. Do you have any question regarding the Chinese school? Any further questions?
Can I just have a feedback to Professor Krasner's question? I'm thinking, how does China matter? Why bring in China? What does that do to our understanding of the world? What kind of different question that Chinese school would ask? I don't know about this, but then I often discuss with my student how long the Chinese authorities would act angrily at a particular target. For Mongolia, who invited Dalai Lama, for example, the anger lasts for 2 weeks. For Norway, the Nobel Prize given to Liu Xiaopo, the anger lasted for 7 years. But that anger didn't really carry any strong penalty for Norway. If you look at the history, then the Chinese always get anger, and a Korean and a Vietnamese friend of mine came together to discuss China's punishment of Korean taking SARS in 2018 or 17, and there was about a year sanction on the Korean merchandising in China. During that period, the Korean ambassador asked Vietnamese sinologist what to do with this. And this senior Vietnamese sinologist telling his Korean ambassador that, don't worry, just wait. And he was actually right. China was, off its anger just a couple months later. That means people especially people around China seems to have a feeling that China cannot be angry forever. Eventually, the Chinese government would say, okay, the punishment is long enough, the other side has learned the lesson. So let's get back to real business. So could we ask the same question to the Americans? How long would American angry at a particular target? For how long? And how American would end its anger and why? Would that be a question that Chinese school bring to the American foreign policy studies? Would that be a meaningful question? That has to do with power, right? There's balance and imbalance, but I don't think American scholar would ask that question.
No, I think it's true that an American scholar would not ask that question. So I think that's absolutely accurate. But I think there's a clear answer. Now, if Nepal or Bhutan say we're angry with the United States, would the United States pay any attention? I think no. If a more powerful state, say China or Russia, is angry at the United States, does the United States pay attention? Absolutely yes. And if you look at American foreign policy, I think, you know, there's a clear, straightforward sort of realist explanation for what the Americans pay attention to. They pay attention to big countries. They don't pay attention to little countries. And if little countries like, let's say, Afghanistan, somehow don't follow the American model, it's their fault. You know, we did a lot. The Afghans weren't able to take what we had to offer, and therefore it's their fault.
So let me say something. See, when you say you pose that question to America, and Steve answers, he means the United States.
Right.
So the sanctioning mechanism in China is in part nationalism, and it's in part Chinese government. And it's a very intricate system of power inside China. When the Chinese government wants to mobilize particularly ethno-nationalism, for example, against the Japanese automobile industry, okay, which can last, and when the Chinese government takes action. And it takes action in part because it's worried about domestic legitimacy. So this conflation of China is in fact a two-sided game.
Right.
Now, Steve, being a statist in some of his work, but not in his work on sovereignty, when he says the basic unit is a ruler, has always talked out of two sides of his mouth, depending on which purpose he wants to serve. So if it's rulers, then it's Biden and the administration, or Trump and the administration. And that's very different from America. America is like China, it's a huge place. Okay, very diverse, much more diverse than China ethnically. And I have a very hard time when Steve says there's power, there's interest, there's ideas, and ideas is complicated. Well, we are scholars, we are teachers. That's our life, Steve. You can't just be reductionist about power as material capabilities, right? And interests are being read offering. Power is much more complex than that. You know that Stefano is here, that's his life's work. So, but the conflation of the United States with America politically is simply a mistake.
No, I don't disagree with that. I think there's a lot of variation across national entities. I'm not sure how that impacts on IR theory, although I think it's extremely important. But as to say we shouldn't have IR theory, you should have theories of particular countries and how they operate, and they operate very differently.
I would also like to say a few words. I would like to have a go at Professor Krasner's very bold, very thought-provoking question. Are there any unique sets of Chinese ideas that can really differentiate China from other countries, and ideas that other countries, especially the West, especially America, must pay attention to? This is a very dramatic question. And I think the way you pose it, I think goes against the grain of quite a number our colleagues here, because a lot of them, as I understand them, seem to hold the view that it's very hard to claim uniqueness anywhere, whether in China or other parts of the world. But nevertheless, I think this is a very interesting and valuable question. And I try to give an answer. And I think that there is an answer, and that is the Chinese concept of Ren. The Chinese pinyin is R-E-N, and there are various translations for this concept. Sometimes it's translated as humanist, sometimes translated as compassion, sometimes translated simply as humanity. And this is the concept originally invented by Confucius himself. It is Confucius's greatest contribution to the Chinese civilization and also to humanity. Now, of course, there are concepts of humaneness and compassion in the West. After all, these are Western terms, those that they are basically used. They use the translations for the Chinese original. But I think the original Chinese concept of Ren does stand out. I think if there is one Chinese concept that can answer your question of uniqueness, then Ren is it. I shall give very quick. I should give a very quick introduction to the context, to the origin of this concept. Ren for Kongzi stands for Confucius, is a sort of universalizable affection. And it stands for basic and, as I said, universalizable aspect of human feelings manifested as love or care for others. And with this concept, Confucius is appealing to a prominent human emotion embedded in every person's psychical reservoir that is capable of being aroused. And once this emotion or feeling is aroused, it can lead to a process of growing human relationships into robust participation in the human community. Now, I'm aware that in the Western tradition, care ethics, for example, is also a very important tradition. But then there is another distinction feature of the concept of Ren, namely it's intimately linked to another Chinese concept of Xin. The Chinese pinyin is X-I-N. And Xin, we must translate it into heart and mind, not heart alone, not mind alone, but heart and mind. And we know that in Western intellectual history, heart and mind often comes into conflict. Just think of what Hume writes about passions and what other philosophers have written about this concept. But in the Chinese tradition, heart and mind go together. We have only one word or one concept for both of those. In the Western history, would be separated notions. And this concept of Xin is a composite notion, treating the emotional and the intellectual as inseparable in a way that is no parallel in the West. I think this claim will be accepted by I think most Western philosophers who are cognizant of the Chinese tradition will agree with this claim, that the Chinese do not, this concept, notion of Ren and Xin, they treat the intellectual and the emotional as inseparable. Unlike for a long stretch of time, Western history, the intellectual and the emotional are treated separately. So that will be my answer to your challenge.
Thank you. Thanks.
But I'm not sure if that's really, I'm not sure if by there we can really claim uniqueness. I would like to rather think in terms of distinctiveness. And here I would like to thank Professor Katzenstein. A long time ago, when I was writing my paper on Chinese exceptionalism, I was wondering whether I should claim uniqueness for Chinese exceptionalism. And he suggested that distinctiveness might be a better word for it.
Yeah, but Feng, then, you gave an essentialist answer, the Chinese tradition. I don't think there is the Chinese tradition. There are multiple Chinese traditions, right? And China is not unique, it's distinctive. So the unraveling of China, just like the unraveling of America, is really what it's all about. And these are multiple and contradictory ideas, and we learn from them and we reformulate them, right?
Right. That's right. Although I should say that the way that I think essentialism would be the only way to answer Professor Krasner's challenge.
Yeah, and that is the trap.
All right. If time allows, I would like to offer to share with you a few of my takeaways from this conference. I think this workshop, this meeting has been extremely fruitful for me. It's really fascinating workshop, and I've learned so much. I agree with Professor Yan that we should be careful with this way of framing things. My contribution to the project of Chinese theories of international relations, I think, principally lies in my really review and introduction to the international scholarly community, the works of Professor Yan Xuetong, and to a lesser extent, Zhao Tingyang's theory of the Tianxia. But I do have a few thoughts arising out of this workshop. First of all, I have a stronger feeling that by we I mean China, us scholars based in China, we should definitely not try to build a Chinese school. I think that's going to be a dead end. We should rather strive for a diversity of different kinds of theories. Chinese theories, or theories with a different name, but I don't think a Chinese school is the way to go. And second, related to my answer to Professor Krasner's question, I don't think we should claim uniqueness of Chinese thought, only distinctiveness. And I've heard a lot of wonderful remarks which show that what we Chinese scholars want to claim uniques, in fact, have long existed in the Western tradition. Part of those ideas we Chinese scholars simply know nothing about. Partly, and some of these scholars we try to dismiss for different reasons. And sometimes these ideas, because they are understood, framed differently, we do not seem to recognize their significance and relevance to Chinese thought. So I think we should really be careful in claiming uniqueness. And third is that Barry made the point of the danger of the arrogance of Chinese power. So China as a rising power should be humble. We Chinese scholars in building theories should also be humble. And that actually is the reason why in my remarks I said that comparative studies and cross-fertilization with Western theory is really going to be very important for Chinese theory, for the project for Chinese scholars to build their own theories. And fourth, I think there's really a need for new round of Sino-Western theory, mutual learning and interactions. As we all know, from the 1980s for 2 decades or more, what Chinese IR did was basically to translate and import Western theories into China and to learn these theories. But this process, about a decade ago, leading Chinese scholars claimed this process was nearing an end, and we should start to build our own theories, hence the project for Chinese school. But I think there is still a wealth of knowledge to be learned, and the learning goes both ways, mutual, Chinese from Western and Western from Chinese. And especially, I think, important that the learning should take, the field, the areas that I think especially important is in epistemology and methodology. and I was quite taken by Peter's exposition of the paradigms, the theoretical and the scientific paradigms that have evolved in Western intellectual history. This sort of research, I don't think in China any scholar has done this sort of research, at least applied to, not in terms applied to China's past, certainly not in terms applied to Western history. And fifth, I think it's also important that Chinese theories, whatever they may be, whatever propositions they might advance, should not be parochially preoccupied with explaining China's rise. That will be far too narrow. As many of our colleagues pointed out here, they should also try to explain other aspects, other aspects of China, of the Chinese experience, other parts of Chinese history, both the central humiliation and its imperial past. But equally important, if not more, is the ability, is the a conscious attempt to use Chinese theories to explain the non-Chinese world, to explain non-Chinese experience. And that will, at least in terms of reception, will make a big contribution to the project of Chinese theories. The sixth, I think, Barry really posed, at the end of his talk, he posed two questions or two problems for Chinese theory. First is how to build Chinese theories without excessive Sinocentrism, or to put it another way, how to build Chinese theories with tolerable Sinocentrism. I think, as you say, it's a hard question, right? I can envisage it two ways. First is, in the source of ideas, the ideas which we draw on for theory building. I think it's important to take a comparative approach. You draw on Chinese ideas, but don't take those ideas as unique. You try to compare those ideas with similar ideas in the Western tradition, and you try to achieve a more sophisticated, deeper understanding of those ideas. And second is in the explanatory value of your theories. You try to explain not just China, but also the non-Chinese world. And also, if your theory is a normative theory, try to offer a set of values that's not just peculiarly or uniquely Chinese. At least you have to say something about the potential of your theory for common human values, common values of humanity. And finally, the difficulty of how to do IR theory in a country how to do IR theory in a country like China. This is, I think, the toughest of all the tough questions. and I don't think I have an answer, but certainly I think this is not a difficulty unique to China. The same questions can be posed to the US, for example. How to do our theory in a country like the United States, right? Especially in the post-World War context, when the US, the government claims itself as the hegemon and leader of liberal international order, and how has that affected American art theory? So I think it's a common challenge to scholars in all the different countries, although the challenge manifests itself in different ways. Thank you.
Okay, Barry, please.
Yeah, I just wanted to chase up a point that Ayşe Zarakol made, which, and asked Chinese colleagues about this, which was, how do you get around the problem that a Chinese school is just a version of standpoint theory? Now, the problem here is, of course, that amongst Chinese colleagues, there are no advocates for the Chinese school because Ren Xiao is not here. So the rest of you are in varying degrees against it. but that struck me as a very interesting question. I mean, I hadn't thought of standpoint theory in that context before, but it makes a lot of sense if you're trying, since the subject of this conference is Chinese school, is that necessarily, inevitably, a form of standpoint theory with all of the advantages and disadvantages that brings with it?
So we have invited many Chinese scholars that disagree with the Chinese school, and we think they're Chinese school scholars. So if permitted, I would like to speak for several minutes to offer another story, a different story about Chinese school. You know, many of you, both our Western friends and Chinese friends, talk about the Chinese school from their ontological, epistemological things. And I probably under the influence of my previous supervisor, Tim Down at Exeter, and further encouraged by my later supervisor, Crystal Smith. So I would like to treat the Chinese school as a kind of academic phenomenon. Like it or not, you have to understand it. So that's my starting point to understand the Chinese school since the year 2006, I guess. So in the last 16 years also, I pretend to be a Chinese school scholar, and professor then believes I'm part of a member of a Chinese school, but I know I'm just trying to be an outside observer of the Chinese school and try to view the Chinese school from a different story. So if permitted, I will spend several minutes to show my story about Chinese school. So my story starts from all of my story are based on my observation of Chinese IS scholars' academic discourses. So first of all, I guess we, from our Chinese scholars' discourse about the history of Chinese IR, we see there are two distinct images of the Chinese IR. The first is the distinct Chinese IR, which is it has a rather late starting point with very different evolution process from that of Western IR. Okay, frequently interfered by political pressure and by political movement. So this kind of Chinese IR theory, history, has the result of such a kind of distinct Chinese IR history is a backward tradition of theoretical study, which is most typically the absence of Chinese IR theory. And then the third feature of the image of distinct Chinese IR is the recent efforts to catch up with Western IR theory. That means a Chinese school movement. So this is a very popular story in Chinese IR discourse in the recent years. Another is a progressive image of Chinese IR, which said, despite the many disadvantaged factors, the Chinese IR scholars has tried to overcome the backward tradition with branches of Chinese school, regardless whether this term is appropriate or not. But this kind of progressive tone is very popular in Chinese IR discourse too. So recent studies of the Chinese IR history has partially challenged this distinct image of Chinese IR because we have successfully put the starting point of Chinese IR to the year late 1920s. That is not very far from a Western IR. So what we need to address is a progressive image. So the Chinese IR school is the key for us to testify this progressive image of the Chinese school. So according to my observation of a Chinese IR theorist discourse about the Chinese school, it's a kind of self-image construction. I have several puzzles about Chinese school. The first is the things that have been repeatedly discussed in today's conference. That is the terminology. The Chinese school a kind of appropriate term. Another thing is the nature of the Chinese school. Is that a national enterprise or academic enterprise? Many of our Western theorists friends have mentioned this. So why the Chinese school is necessary? Chinese IR theorists, according to their answer, I categorize their answer into three types. The first is Western IR theory is unreliable because it has failed to cover non-Western experience, including Chinese reason, ancient Chinese thought. That is exactly what Professor Yan Xuetong has argued. The second is Western IR theory is unreliable because undesirable, because it is useless to China's rights. It's a kind of political implication here. And the third is that mainly from some scholars from Fudan University, that Western international practice is disastrous. under the guidance of Western IS theory. So these are the main three reasons to explain that Chinese scholars use these three main reasons to explain why Chinese school is necessary. But I think none of these are very convincing at all. Another question is the purpose of the Chinese school. So Chinese school scholars might say, according to their discourse, the first one is for national interest, to guide and explain China's international practice. As Professor Qin has said, China does not need to accept Western norms and could peacefully rise without accepting the primary and secondary institutional setting. That is a kind of academic position for national interest. The second is academic position to resist the Western academic hegemony. That is what exactly a young scholar from Peking University has stated in the year 2000, the very beginning of the Chinese school. Another group of Chinese scholars think the Chinese school could increase the theoretical diversity of Western IR, of the IR discipline as a whole. And the third group seeks universal knowledge. It's partly, I guess, it's partly what Professor Yan is looking for. So another unresolved question or puzzle about the Chinese school is its history. We all believe that the consensus is that Chinese school started from the year 2000, but we know before the year 2000, there is another kind of Chinese school movement, which is called IR theory with Chinese characteristics, which is said to be guided by Marxism to protect the Marxism ideology in Chinese IR theoretical studies. So the fourth puzzle is output of Chinese school. So how many branches? Some of the Western theorists has also raised the question. So what is inside, what is outside of Chinese school? If we limited our focus on the Chinese school as a movement starting from the year 2000, I strongly insisted that Tianxia system is not part of the Chinese school because it's separated, developed, and it's only recently been put into the Chinese school. So I know the journal International Theory has recently published an article entitled "Withering Chinese IR," use a new Tianxianism figure, Xu Jilin from the Huadong Normal University, as an example to criticize the Chinese school. But we all know that Xu Jilin is not part of a Chinese school scholar. He's even not part of the Chinese IR scholar. So this is inside-outside issue has not been addressed regarding the Chinese school. And the second, and another thing is academic quality of the Chinese school. Is it consistent and precise? Is it empirical and tenable? Is it theoretically original? All these questions has been raised by our Western theorists today. So the last question no one has raised is the future of the Chinese school. What's the relation between Chinese school and Western IR theory? So these are the things, the puzzles I have had after around 16 years observation of the Chinese school from the year 2006 to the year 2021. I have all these puzzles about the Chinese school, and I share these puzzles with both our Chinese and Western theorists here. So my observation is existing discourse about the Chinese school has failed to do the things, still have failed to offer a consistent and coherent study, a story about its emergence and evolution. So all the story about Chinese school is discursive at best, self-contradictory at the worst. Second, we do not reflect on the knowledge making and evaluation process of Chinese IR scholars of how they constructed the IR theory. We do not have any empirical studies of how Professor Qin or Professor Yan or Professor Xiao has constructed their theoretical entities in recent 5 years after 20 years hard working. We do not have read the text, not to say, but some of us have analyzed the context. But no, we do not have theories to read the text as Toni has done just before. And so without this kind of reflection, and we do not have comprehensive review of the branch of the Chinese theoretical output, and we do not but fortunately, we have identified the main issues and needs to address in the future. So these are my observation and suggestion. And the last is one of my recent study of the Chinese school is correlation with the Sinocentrism and the trusted relationship between Chinese and Western scholars. And this is part of my primary impulse for me to organize such kind of this conference, because I believe the more communication between Chinese and Western scholars, the more comparative between each other would make us better understanding each other's position and to manage ethnocentrism, if not completely eliminated it. Thank you. So we are almost up we only have 4 minutes or 6 minutes for the conference. If anyone has any question regarding Chinese school to Professor Qin, Professor Yan or Professor Shi or any Chinese school
Stefano
scholars
has
here.
a question or a comment.
No? Any question, comments are welcome.
Yeah, in fact, it is almost an invitation not to have, I mean, for self-reflection, it's an invitation all of us should take seriously. Also the historical part of how particular research agendas come into being. But identify the main themes as if there needs to be one centralized main theme provider in which you all come together. Let flowers blossom a little bit. I think there's so much that one can learn from the outside. I mean, for me, this invitation was very, very useful because, yes, I work on relational theory for quite a while, but it is used in a different manner. And then Xing I know from before, but Shi was different. And there are many things which made me think about possible relationships to theories of social recognition, gift making, the Marcel Mauss tradition, and so on, and just to bounce back and forth ideas which have to do with these traditions which seem to speak to each other and which might find, as he invites us to find some translations in which I can also make better sense of it. So for me, that is the interesting part, and whatever you play with and can make us play with, that's I think it's fine. As somebody said before, people will listen to it. You have too many channels already out there. In that regard, China is very privileged. I mean, it is, of course, talking to an American-centered or US-centered discipline, but that is something you share with many others who are outside of the US or the UK, and who have to engage with and have tried to make their way with it. So I would like to use this at the end for myself to thank you very much for the initiative and for me, for a possibility also to build on something for my own work.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you for Chinese and Western series to gather together. If you don't have any further question raised to our Chinese series, let's call it the end of this conference. Thank you very much. And it's really a nice, it's really my pleasure to see many of our series and many of my friends here. Thank you. And
thanks for
good afternoon, good night. See you next time. Bye. See you.
Thank you very much.
Bye. Bye. Bye.
Bye. Bye. Bye. Thank you.